You know, I've always had a soft spot for discussing the school year, since it was the first school year I ever went into detail about in Storytime, which was literally the second Storytime I ever made, recorded way back on January 8th, 2021. Just to give you all an idea of how long ago that was, I was 16 years old and in the 11th grade when I wrote and recorded it. I'm now 19 years old and a senior in college. Yeah, time flies really quickly. Additionally, that was way back when I used to have gameplay in the background and even recorded Storytimes with my phone. Those were the good old days. However, in Storytime 2, as well as when I redid it for Storytime 37 months later, I exclusively focused on my freshman year of high school and not the other things going on. While this did make sense since I wanted to stay on topic, you don't really get the full picture of the school year and what was happening behind the scenes, if you know what I mean. Like, while freshman year had a lot going for it and was really eventful, there was a lot of non-academic stuff that had a huge impact on me during this time, with church and swimming being the two biggest things. So for part 5 of the extensive reflection project, I thought that I'd go over my freshman year of high school in addition to those behind-the-scenes events that discuss how these events made my 9th grade school year a very memorable one. I'm Zach, and this is Storytime 56, on October 13th, 2023. So, before I begin, I want to first remind y'all this is part 5 in an 8-part series I'm doing where I reflect over my school years. In the last part, which was of course part 4, I discussed my 8th grade school year as well as the summer prior to starting 8th grade, that being the summer of 2017. If you haven't seen it, then I would highly recommend watching it first so that you are not completely lost in the story time, since I'll be referencing it as well as parts 1, 2, and 3 quite a bit in the story time. Alright, so just like how the other parts in the story time was structured, I'm first going to discuss the summer prior to the school year, which in this case, the summer of 2018, and then I'll talk about the school year. But before I get to that, first gotta give you all a backstory, where I'm going to be summarizing part 4 as well as explaining my school and church. Alright, so for anyone who has seen part 4, you know how dreadful 8th grade was for me. I was bullied and harassed relentlessly, was incredibly stressed out with excessive homework and difficult classes, and was getting into drama online. All these factors caused me to develop depression early into the school year. While depression wasn't so bad at first, it got really bad. So bad in fact that it led to me being suicidal and harming myself and eventually led to me attempting suicide. Thankfully, I was able to get professional help after my attempt. And thanks to the amazing doctors and nurses, as well as incredible support from my peers, I was able to overcome my suicidal thoughts and my depression entirely, resulting in a time period I referred to as the post-depression period part 1, which lasted from March 13th, 2018 to November 17th of that year. Later into the story time, I'll explain why this time period ended, as well as introduce post-depression period part 2. But anyways, this time period resulted in me living some of the best days of my life. It was a time period of happiness, rest, and satisfaction knowing that I had conquered the toughest battle of my whole life. I look back on this time period a lot and often refer to it as my peak happiness, as I was pretty much at an all-time high in terms of happiness during this time, although I'd reached that point again in post-depression period part 2. Anyways, one of the biggest things that happened during this time period was getting accepted to an early college high school. So in February of 2018, I applied to go here since not only had I considered going there since 6th grade, but I also wanted to get away from the bullies as well as be around others who had the same beliefs as me regarding education. So I sent my application and in May, I was offered admission, which I was really happy about since this school had only a 25% acceptance rate. As a result, I would go here instead of a traditional public school for high school. Now you might be asking, what is early college? Well, basically, it's a high school where you can get both a high school diploma and an associate's degree when you graduate, all for free, so you get to knock out 2 years of college. This is technically a 5-year program, but the very vast majority of students do it in 4 years, although I managed to do it even quicker, and I'll explain how in parts 7 and 8. Now, another unique thing about my school was that it followed the expeditionary learning curriculum, so this is a unique type of learning that takes a hands-on approach. While we still had to do tests and quizzes per state standards, we did a lot more projects and hands-on stuff. Like when we get to discussing my school year, I go into great detail about how each high school class I took used the hands-on learning approaches and how it made learning a lot more fun and exciting than it was back in middle school. This was ultimately one of the goals I had in mind when writing Storytime 43, which I released a week after graduating high school where I discussed each class I took and how this curriculum was applied. In this story time and the rest of the series though, I go into much further detail about each class and how this curriculum was used for almost everything we did. Now, Expeditionary learning also has its own curriculum that complements this hands-on approach. It's quite difficult to give a clear definition of it, but some topics discussed from this curriculum include the natural world, acts of kindness, teamwork, the having of wonderful ideas, and other stuff of this nature. We did these things called intensives, where we applied the topics from the curriculum with hands-on approach. Sometimes these involve doing field trips, while others involve field trips coming to us. I'll talk more about intensives later on in the story time, so they should make a lot more sense at the end. So, outside of academics, another big thing going on with me at the time was religion and church. So in May of 2017, me and my family started going to this large Southern Baptist church so that me and my sister Zoe could be involved. As our old church did not have anyone our age, and amongst the kids who attended, all of them were homeschooled. Me and Zoe both were quickly welcomed to the church, and we quickly made friends. Pretty soon, I was friends with all the guys in my grade and did church activities with them 3 times a week. Worship service on Sundays, youth on Wednesdays, and Monday night small groups at a youth leader's home. This was very important for me at the time, since as mentioned earlier, I dealt with depression throughout 8th grade, and after my suicide attempt, these guys became vital in helping me recover and making me feel loved and cared for. I got my classes switched to be with them, and as a result, I was always looked after and was able to become very happy. However, I'm no longer friends with them or even a Southern Baptist anymore, although I'm still very much a Christian and a child of God. I'll explain what my friends at church did that made me cut them off in a little bit, and I'll talk about how it eventually led to me begin questioning and leaving the Baptist denomination entirely at the beginning of part 6. But to get back on a lighter note, I would also make the greatest decision I ever made, and ever will make in my entire life, accepting Jesus. I did this at a church event called D-Now 2018. Then a month later, I got baptized. I explain this much more in detail in part 4, so if y'all want to hear what I refer to as my testimony, watch part 4. Alright, so I think that wraps up the backstory. So let's move on to the summer of 2018. So firstly, this was one of the best summers ever. Like, even though it was short because early college started sooner than public schools, it was still a great summer and had a lot going for it. And considering this was also during the post-depression period part 1, as well as just being the summer after the hardest school year ever, 8th grade, yeah, you can see why this was such an amazing summer for me. Anyways, on Thursday, June 14th, me and my family went up to Delaware to visit family. So my uncle and his 2 kids live up in Delaware, and we usually get together 4 times a year: Easter, summer, Thanksgiving, and the day after Christmas. Usually we go up there for summer and the day after Christmas, while they come down for Easter and Thanksgiving. So that's what happened here. We went up there for our summer Delaware trip. This was a unique trip since we decided to take a different route. So I live and grew up in Charlotte. My family in Delaware lives in Dover, the state capital, as well as an outer suburb of Philadelphia. So therefore, we usually get on I-85 and take it all the way until it ends at the interchange with I-95 about 30 minutes south of Richmond, Virginia, which we take up to Washington, D.C. From there, we take the Chesapeake Bay Bridge in Maryland to get to Delaware. But for this trip, we decided to take I-77 and then I-81 throughout Western Virginia, which is a really mountainous part of the state. We got to D.C. via I-66 and took the normal route there. This was a longer trip, but it was more interesting since we were up in the mountains and saw a lot more nature. Anyways, as for what we did up there, I don't really remember all too well. We probably went to the beach one day since they live like 30 minutes from the beach, but other than that, I don't really remember much from this particular trip. Then on Sunday, June 17th, we headed back home where we simply took the normal route. However, I only got to spend that night at home, as the next day, I would take off out of town again. Only this time, it was for a church trip called M-Fuge, or Fuge as I'll refer to it as. I have referenced this trip multiple times in previous parts of the series, as this is the church trip that ultimately made me end my friendship with my friends and also begin to hate my church. It would also be when I developed religious trauma, which I still have today even if I no longer go to this church anymore or associate with Southern Baptist theology. Anyways, before I get too far ahead of myself, I should probably explain what Fuge is because you're probably sitting there wondering, what the fuck is Fuge? So, Fuge is a 6-day program where churches take their youth groups to a Christian college that basically hosts this event. Attendees get to live in the dorms for the week, eat in the dining halls, and do huge worship sessions with everyone, which I'll refer to as big-ass sessions, in the auditorium. So pretty much, we got to be college students for a week and enjoy college life. However, attendees also get to go out into the community and do volunteer mission work, which we call tracks. I'll explain my track more in a bit. As for Fuge 2018 in particular, it took place at Belmont University, private Christian university in Nashville, Tennessee. It lasted from Monday, June 18th to Saturday, June 23rd. This was actually a little problematic because my birthday is June 21st, so I ended up having to spend my 14th birthday on this trip. I'll discuss how that went when we get there. Anyways, the drive to Nashville for my church is about 6.5 hour drive, so for it, our church rented out this coach bus with a lot of convenient stuff. I'll talk more about it in a second. Anyways, I was really excited to attend Fuge. Everyone only had good things to say about it, and my friends all said that they had a blast at Fuge the year before. Additionally, they said that they were really excited for me to attend with them and to spend time with me up there. We'll see in a little bit how these words did not translate into actions when we get there. So with that, let's discuss the ride up there in the first day of Fuge. So on Monday, June 18th, Mom woke me up around 6 a.m. My stuff was already packed, so I didn't have to worry about it. Mom then got me some Hardee's for breakfast, and then we got to church at around 7 a.m. Mom helped me with my stuff, loaded on the bus, and then I talked to my friends. A little while later, we boarded the bus and headed off to Nashville. Now, for this bus trip, I sat with a friend who I've not really talked about too much, as we usually didn't get to do much on church trips together. The reason being is that she was a rising 11th grade girl, while I was of course a rising 9th grade guy. While my church wasn't like boys and girls should never be friends, they still looked down upon teams of opposite genders being friends, which to me is stupid because the moment we turn 18, our church expects us to get married and pump out kids. This would actually be a doctrinal reason that made both me and this girl leave this church, since she would pretty much do the same thing I did a year later, which I'll get to at the beginning of part 6. But on the ride up there, we both played Clash Royale together, since both of us really enjoyed that game. We teamed up and played double battles and won almost all of them since I was a lot higher level than her, giving us a huge advantage since our opponents were usually around her level. Anyways, about halfway there, we stopped at a Chick-fil-A to eat lunch. I'm not too sure where we ate Chick-fil-A, but if I had to guess, it was probably in Knoxville, since even though it's a little more than halfway there aren't really many places to stop in between Asheville and Knoxville, since it's mostly just mountains and back roads excluding I-40, which is of course the road we were on for the vast majority of the trip. Very, very beautiful drive, don't get me wrong, just not a lot of places to stop. I actually got to drive on this part of I-40 with my grandmother back in July, and even though I'm not a fan of how curvy the roads get, it's still an incredibly scenic and beautiful drive. I'll link a video of someone driving from Asheville to Knoxville because it's not something you'll get anywhere else. Anyways, we stopped at Chick-fil-A and then we hit the road. Not too much later, we hit the central time zone, so we all had to turn our clocks back an hour, although my phone switched automatically so I didn't have to mess with it. Then a while later, we made it to Nashville and entered Belmont's campus. We got there early, so we still had some time before moving into our rooms. So in the meantime, we did some quote-unquote fun stuff. One of those fun stuff was taking pictures. So we as a church got right in front of this huge grass plane and got our picture taken. This wouldn't have been so bad if it wasn't 100 degrees outside, but, I mean, I couldn't do anything about the weather, so I just had to deal with it. Afterwards, we did arguably the third worst thing that happened on this trip, that being the church clap. So for those who've seen part 3 or 4, y'all will immediately understand why I hate the church clap so much. So basically, the church clap is this trap Christian song that has a dance to it. We were taught the dance to it before moving in, and let's just say that it was torture. I hate dancing with a passion, and after enduring 2 years of it in middle school PE, I hated it more than anything. Unfortunately, this would not be the last time we did the church clap, as we would do it again during Big Ass Session and a couple times at Trex. Once that was finished, it was time for the worst thing that happened on this trip, that being Fuge 2018. Shit, I lost my place. Okay, so let's retry that. Once that was finished, it was time for the worst thing that happened on this trip. What makes Fuge 2018 the worst trip I ever attended, and what caused me to develop religious trauma moving in. So our youth pastor took us boys to the boys' dorm while his wife took the girls. We then all walked to the dorm where we were asked to find someone to room with, since the dorms we were staying in were traditional rooms and were 2 beds with a community bathroom and showers on each floor. Most people were able to find a partner very quickly. I had quite a few people in mind regarding who I wanted to room with. However, everyone whom I had in mind had already had a partner. I then asked more and more people until eventually, I was the only one without a roommate. I then let my youth pastor know, so he asked everyone if they had a roommate. Sure enough, they all said yes, meaning I was the only one without a roommate since there was an odd number of us. This meant that now, my youth pastor had a big problem, since one of his youth members did not have a roommate. The optimal solution would have been to let me in a room by myself, since not only would this fix the roommate issue, but I also would have had an amazing time here since of course I would have gotten my own room and got some much needed alone time. However, this camp was strictly against any attendees having their own room for some reason, so this would not have worked. Therefore, my youth pastor had to come up with another solution. So his solution was that I can room with him, since he of course was going to still be living in the dorm. So he asked if I was cool with that, to which I was, since he was a really cool person, especially after all the help that I've received from him earlier that year. So we got checked in and I started to unpack my stuff while he did his. However, that's when a future representative came over and told my youth pastor that he could not room with me, as youth pastors could not room with youth members. My youth pastor, who at this point was really frustrated with the Fuge staff since they were being obnoxious, asked him what he could do. That Fuge staff member then said that I could share a room already occupied and move my bed in with 2 others, making that a room of 3. So we ultimately had to do that. My youth pastor found a room and asked the 2 in the room if they were cool with me rooming with them. They said that they were, so I began getting my stuff to their room. However, here's what really blew this situation out of proportion, as well as when my friendships with those boys in my grade ended. So, in addition to my stuff, I also had to move in the bed mattress and a couple other stuff from my youth pastor's room into the new room. But as I was carrying the mattress, some of the boys from my grade, the same people who said they were excited to attend Fuge with me and then left me out, came up and started questioning why I was carrying a mattress. I told them, and they all started laughing at me, calling me names, and making fun of me for not having a roommate. This was pretty much the moment that made me realize that for an entire year, they put on a facade. They were not my real friends, but rather fakes who took advantage of me during my lowest point during my 8th grade school year, and then decided to be assholes at Fuge. So much for, if we want to be effective, then we have to be together, back from D now and back in April that year. Once I got to my room, I pretty much decided I did not want to be friends with any of them anymore, as of course they were fakes. So that was the moment that ended my friendship with them, as well as the second of only 3 times I've ever ended a friendship in my whole life. What a bunch of fucking pieces of shit. I hope they're all doing horribly, and I hope that one day this comes back to bite them, if it hasn't already in the 5 years since this happened. Now, this also begs the question, why did they do this? A simple "they're just fakes" is, in my opinion, not a good enough solution, as they had to have already had a reason for doing this. I do not know for sure. However, I theorized 2 really good explanations when writing Storytime 29 that I think would be most likely the case. The first and probably the most likely case was due to where I was going to high school. So as mentioned, I got accepted at an early college and went there for high school. I was the only member at our church going here, as everyone else was going to the local public high school. This might seem irrelevant, but when you consider the fact that when I told them that I was going to early college and they disapproved, you can kind of see why. I'm not sure if they were jealous or what, but my peers were not happy when I told them that I got accepted. So this might have been a reason as to why they did what they did at Fuge, since they thought that now that I wasn't going to their school, I was no longer part of the group and didn't fit in, which to some extent is true since I couldn't talk about teachers, classes, drama, or anything that went on since I didn't go to their school, but it still didn't warrant them to treat me like how they did here. The other explanation, as well as the less likely one, but still a good explanation, involves the bullies from 8th grade. So I went through all the details about the bullies, how they bullied me, and where they bullied me in part 4. However, one thing I mentioned in part 4 was after my suicide attempt, while the bullies lost a significant amount of respect and popularity after people realized what they pushed me to do, they still maintained and held on to some of their popularity and friends. My friends from church were all friends with the bullies, even after all the shit they did and said to me. This should have been an immediate red flag for me, although since my social skills were and still are below average, so I didn't see anything wrong. So what my theory is that the bullies told my church friends to do this, since they still hated my guts even after my attempt. Like a month after my attempt and while I had a broken arm, one of them literally hit me with a cardboard sword and arm. So it was clear that they had still not let me go, just that it was a lot tougher to get me since I constantly was around friends and had my classes switched. So it was very much possible that they told my peers at church to do this, and so they followed through. Those are my 2 explanations I have for why this happened. I can't exactly gather information very easily since I would literally have to ask those who left me out and harassed me at Fuge, and because I'm 100% not doing that, I'll likely never know the true reason. But I can at least come up with some good theories as to why it happened. However, believe it or not, this wasn't my peers' fault entirely. The church itself also caused the situation. They brought an odd number of boys to Fuge despite the fact that they knew the dorms were 2-person rooms. Someone in the church administration should have looked at the roster and realized, oh shit, we have an odd number of boys. We need to make arrangements so someone doesn't get left out. But no, they were completely oblivious to this, and as a result, I was left out. That also brings me to another theory I have regarding the situation. If the church brought an odd number of boys, then they likely brought an odd number of girls as well, assuming they brought an even number of attendees given the dorm conditions. If this was the case, then a girl may have also had the same experience as I did. although maybe not to the same severities as I did, as I know girls tend to handle this type of stuff better than boys. However, it is also possible that the church brought an odd number of participants, meaning an odd number of boys and an even number of girls. If that was the case, then that means the church did literally nothing to prevent something like this, since by bringing an odd number of participants, they knew a situation like this would happen. What the church should have done was do like what they did back at Winter Retreat 2018, where they assigned us roommates a week prior. We could ask to be placed with someone, but the assignments were created by our youth pastor. That's what should have happened here, but they decided not to do that, and as a result, they caused a youth member to turn away from the church and deal with religious trauma. Speaking of which, I should also talk about that, as while I've described it for pretty much as long as I've been doing Storytime, I've never really called it that or talked about its effects. So religious trauma pretty much speaks for itself. It's trauma caused by either the church, church leaders, or church members. From my experience with talking to others with religious trauma, this is especially common amongst LGBTQ members, since evangelical churches have notably harsh, extremist, and just downright unbiblical stances on homosexuality that they justify by cherry-picking Bible verses. My old church did this all the time with not just homosexuality, but other things too. And I'll talk about how that also turned me away from this church and the Baptist denomination entirely in part 6. But religious trauma is also common amongst people who were wronged and put in bad situations as a result of the actions of church members. So of course things like getting left out and bullied at Fuge, but also things like sexual abuse, blackmailing, and churches just flat out trying to control people's lives. Honestly, there's not a set definition for religious trauma since it is an incredibly broad topic, but that's kind of the idea. But no matter what causes it, religious trauma still does exactly what it sounds like, gives trauma in religious settings. Whenever I go to a local Bible study on campus, visit a local church, or go to my old church when I'm at home since my parents don't give me the option, I usually get really shaky and scared, as my religious trauma causes me to stimulate in religious settings. I found that playing with the squishy toy helps a ton, so I do that to calm myself in religious settings. But even then, I still get shaky and scared knowing that I'm in a religious setting, even if I'm not even with the Southern Baptist. That's ultimately why the stuff that happened at Fuge still impacts me today, even now as an adult, since the trauma has not gone away and it will likely stay with me for a very long time. Ultimately, it would be the main reason I left my church and denomination, since it would only get worse and worse. This would also be the beginning of what I like to refer to as the conflict at church, as this issue was not Fuge exclusive since I went to church with all these guys. At first, even though this was already a very depressing and bad moment for me, the conflict wasn't really too intense, but 3 days later, it would become super intense. The intensity of this conflict would be what led to things such as me purposely disconnecting myself from everyone, questioning my church and its beliefs, and eventually leaving the Southern Baptist denomination entirely. The first two mentioned will be discussed in part 6, while the third one is very recent and would make for a story time of its own. Now, I can't exactly say that this situation was completely terrible, as there was at least something good that came out of it. So the two boys I was now sharing a room with were really cool. Both of them were rising 8th graders, so it wasn't anyone who purposely left me out and made fun of me. One of them didn't really talk to me, but was still made him way better than anyone in my grade, so I still consider him cool. But the other one felt super sorry for me. He also just so happened to be the younger brother of that girl I was good friends with, so he was really friendly and towards me and respected me because of how I treated his sister. Learned that his name was Preston, and also discovered that we had a lot in common. One thing in particular we had in common was Geometry Dash. So I started playing Geometry Dash back in February of 2018, so I was still new and trying to beat the official levels. I believe I was on Dryout at the time, while he had just beaten Club Step, so he was much further along in skill than I was, although I did eventually get to his skill level, but it would take a couple years. But anyways, he felt really bad for me after all that I had to go through, so he decided to jump in and basically befriend me, since I was already good friends with his sister, so at least something good did come from the situation. Although, 2.5 years later, something really bad would happen to Preston that I'll discuss in part 7. But at least once we were all settled, we got to go eat at dining halls for dinner. Even though it was only like 5 o'clock, we did have an early start, so it makes sense why we had dinner so early. As for the dining hall itself, it was quite large. While not nearly as large as the 2 dining halls at my college, since both of them were much larger given that my college is much larger than Belmont, it was still quite vast with a whole bunch of different food options. I don't think any students were here, only Fuge attendees. Which, I should also mention that we were not the only church attending, as there were I think 25 other churches attending this event. Therefore, the dining hall was just as crowded as the ones at my school, since my school has a big issue with admitting literally everyone. But at least because of this, our church let us sit anywhere we wanted and pretty much do anything we'd like just as if we were actual college students. I chose to sit with my roommates, so me, Preston, and the other kid at the table with each other. Preston's sister also joined us, so it was 4 of us at a booth. After dinner, we had our first Big Ass session. So, as mentioned, Big Ass sessions took place in the auditorium, which wasn't too far from the cafeteria, so we had a short walk there. Anyways, the Big Ass sessions at Fuge were actually quite weird. In part 1, I talked about Big Ass sessions back at VBS, where we would sing and dance to the VBS songs and then also watch one part of a 5-part video where a kid or a group of kids had to deal with a bad guy. Meanwhile, in part 4, the Big Ass sessions at Winter Retreat and D-Now were more like concerts where a band would play some songs and then a preacher would give a sermon. You can kind of think of the Big Ass sessions from Fuge as a mixture of these. We still had a band play and a preacher at a local megachurch give a sermon. However, we also watched this video series where a group of special agents were trying to spread the word of God while bad guys tried to stop him, similar to the one from VBS 2014 where he did the special agents team. Just that for this series, the actors were all adults, and while still not very graphic, it had a little more action than the one from VBS all those years ago, since Fuge is intended for middle and high schoolers, not elementary schoolers. We did 2 Big Ass sessions every day, with one in the morning and one at night, with the morning ones being shorter and not including a sermon, while the night ones did include a sermon. As for the band and preacher, I don't really remember who they were, so we can skip over them. Now, after night Big Ass sessions, I was usually completely tired. As I've mentioned in past story times, I'm very sensitive to loud noises and get exhausted by being around people. And even though it was only 10 o'clock by the time these Big Ass sessions ended, I was ready to go to bed. However, my church had different plans. After each night's Big Ass session, we went to a classroom in a nearby building and did what I refer to as church group time. Church group time was where we basically did a lesson as a youth group. I don't remember most of these since I barely paid attention due to how exhausted I was, but I do remember Thursday night's one really well, but not for a good reason, and I'll discuss why later. At least after these ended, which would have been around 11 o'clock, we could finally go to our rooms and go to sleep. Since we were expected to get up at 6 a.m. for 6:30 breakfast, I decided it would be best to go to sleep as soon as possible. Preston and my other roommate had the same philosophy, so once we got back to our room, we 3 went to bed. Well, at least we tried to. You see, while we wanted to get enough sleep for the next day, the rest of the guys in our youth group had a different idea. They decided to stay up all night and make as much noise as possible. Like, I remember that night, me, Preston, and the other roommate woke up to them screaming and running around the halls at 2 a.m. This absolutely pissed us all off, but we didn't say or anything since we knew nothing would come about it, especially given how immature these guys were. And to make things worse for me in particular, I was freezing at night. Although Nashville is an incredibly hot city in the summer, with it at one point exceeding 100 degrees during the week, the temperature dropped drastically at night. Clearly I didn't learn back from camp from part 2 that a simple fitted sheet and a blanket was not sufficient to keep me warm, as that's all I packed with me as far as bedding is concerned. This resulted in me getting really cold at night, making it all the harder for me to go to sleep on top of the other guys being loud and obnoxious. And unfortunately, this would go on for the whole week, so needless to say, I didn't sleep all that well my entire time here. But yeah, that was a rough night as well as a rough day as a whole. While nowhere near as bad as March 7th or 8th, and from earlier that year as I discussed in part 4, June 18th, 2018 was a really horrible day for me, since it marked the beginning of my troubles with my church and still rage on today. It also was just a downright embarrassing day for me too, although that would ultimately be the case every day for the rest of this trip. So let's move on to the next day, being Tuesday, June 19th. This day was at least a lot better than the day before, but it still sucked on its own way. To start, I ended up waking up at 4 a.m. to the other roommate's alarm. Apparently he had difficulty waking up, so we set multiple alarms until we could eventually had to get up at 6 a.m. But, as you can expect, me and Preston weren't very happy about this, since his alarm also woke us 2 up as well. That morning, I told him to only have 1 alarm since me and Preston didn't want to wake up at 4 in the morning, and this kid wholeheartedly refused, saying a lot of just really stupid and nonsensical stuff. Preston then chimed in and told him that he'd wake him up himself, as Preston usually got up early naturally, and that kid still refused. After going back and forth as well as Preston brought up the night before regarding the assholes on our floor making noise and screaming, our roommate finally gave in and ended up not setting up any alarms. So for the duration of the trip, Preston woke him up. This would actually prove to be ideal for me as well, as that morning was the only morning I ate breakfast. So I ate breakfast with Preston and the other roommate, and I was not a fan. So I decided that for the remainder of the week, I was going to sleep in until 7:30. Preston was cool with this idea and promised to wake me up then. So starting the next day, I'd be woken up by Preston later and immediately go to the morning Big Ass session. Speaking of which, the morning Big Ass session went pretty similarly as the one the night before. We sang songs, well, everyone else did, I didn't sing, and did a morning devotion. We didn't have a sermon or watch the second part of the video series, as those were exclusive to night sessions. And that's probably for the better, since not only did I get very little sleep the night before, but I am also not a morning person at all. Like, I remember taking Western History and Culture my first semester of college. It was a brutal class because not only was it a 9 a.m. class that met Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and attendance was required, but my professor also never taught the class and just went on rants. Yeah, that class was awful, and I barely paid attention since I was still trying to wake up. Oh, and I also gave that professor a 1 on my Rate My Professor, since he 100% deserved it and still to this day is the worst professor I've ever had. I talked more about him in Storytime 46, so watch it if you want to hear more about my experience with that course. But getting back on topic, this is pretty much how morning Big S sessions worked, as I was still trying to wake up. However, I don't know if I was the only night person at this whole event or if everyone drank like 10 cans of Red Bull, but everyone was energetic as hell. Like, the session was super loud, people were doing the church clap outside as I was walking to the auditorium with my church, and people were just hyper and full of energy. Considering most of these people didn't get any sleep the night before, since they were running around halls and screaming, as well as because nobody gets much sleep on church trips, I have no idea how the fuck these people had infinite energy, but they did. But at least after the session, we were then taken outside and joined our track groups. So tracks, as stated earlier, were like missions groups. Tracks could be with people not in our church, or in my case, nobody from my church other than my youth pastor, which was very ideal after what happened the day before. Tracks would group up after morning Big S sessions, and we would know where to go since the track leader for each group would wave a flag with the track number. Afterwards, we would go to a classroom and do a Bible study with the track leader. After that, we went to our mission sites and did missions. So that's pretty much how tracks worked. My track in particular was summer camp. So Fuge owned and ran a free summer camp for inner city kids, who weren't necessarily at risk, but not in a good family situation. While this camp did have some at-risk kids, this summer camp was used more as a last resort for parents who need somewhere to place their kids while they work or do whatever they do during the day. So our job was pretty much to go in and love these kids, play with them, and just be their friend and act like role models to them. As for the track leader, he was a really cool and easy to talk to guy. He was a rising senior at Belmont, so he knew his way around campus as well as Nashville as a whole. So if we had any questions about campus, college life, or Nashville, he was the guy to go to. As for the track group, these people were by far some of the nicest and best people I've ever had the honor of meeting and hanging out with. Of course, nobody was from my church except my youth pastor, who supervised this track, so that already made it really good. But the people in my group were just really cool, really friendly, and just so down to earth. Like, even though I had an overall horrible experience at Fuge, I still miss my track group, since they were all super awesome and amazing people. I think a lot of this had to do with diversity. So all 15 of us came from different churches in different parts of the country. Like, we had people as far north as New Jersey, to as south as Florida, to as west as Utah. Yeah, we were from all over different areas of the country, so we were able to kind of talk about where we're from and how life is for us and where we're from, allowing us to learn more about each other and get along really well. Anyways, after the morning Big S session, everyone then made their way outside and found the flag that corresponded with their group. I've since forgotten my group number, but at the time, I knew it by heart since we were all given our track numbers the week prior, so it didn't take long for me to find my group's flag and join them. Once all of us were in the group, we then went to a classroom and did our Bible study. Well, on this particular day, we didn't do a Bible study, as it was more just an introduction to tracks, and we got to meet our track leaders and our peers. The next day, though, we'd start the Bible studies. Anyways, during this time, I ended up making 2 friends. One was a kid named Jason. Jason came from Jackson, Mississippi. He was actually quite a lot like me. He was rather shy, rather quiet, and liked video games. He was also my age, so we got along pretty well. As for the other friend, I don't remember his name, but I remember that he came from Austin, Texas, so I'll call him Austin for the duration of the story time. But anyways, Austin was a little older than me and Jason, being a rising senior, but nonetheless, me and Jason were still able to get pretty close with him. He was a little more outgoing than us, which is actually how I met Jason since he befriended both of us easily and we were able to form a friend group of 3. Now, probably the main thing I remember about Austin was his love for Clash Royale. Now, I introduced this game in part 3, since it came out globally in 2016 and me and everyone else were really crazy about this game. Like, my school even had a clan and we had a lot of fun playing the game together. However, by the end of 7th grade, the hype around this game died out and since then, most people at school quit the game. I, however, stayed up and continued playing, and I would continue playing this game until August, and then I'll get to why that happened when we get there. I'd at least come back in 2021, although I'd lose motivation when they increased the legendary arena cap to 5,000 trophies. I really hated that since the leagues were what kept me interested in the game, since I was reaching Challenger 3 on both of my accounts and enjoyed pushing without any risk. But I'll talk more about my return to the game in Part 7. For now, just know that both me and Austin were crazy about this game. Albeit, Austin was much better at the game than I was, but we were able to get Jason interested in the game. So during Bible studies, as well as on our way to track sites, we would play Clash Royale together. After the Bible study, we had track time, where we would spend a few hours with our track sites and do what our track was assigned. As mentioned, my track was summer camp. However, on this day in particular, the kids who attended this camp were on a field trip, so we didn't hang out with them. But we were still able to do our track, as there was another summer camp that we went to. So this summer camp was run by a gym called Hadley Park Regional Center in the Hadley Park neighborhood, which is in West Nashville, right across the road from Tennessee State University. Hadley Park is considered to be one of the poorest and one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Nashville. The Hadley Park Regional Center, which pretty much runs just like a YMCA, was a gym where people could go in and work out, but it also hosted a summer camp for kids. Many of these kids come from struggling families, with the majority of them having one or both parents incarcerated. Just like the summer camp that Fuge sponsored, this summer camp was also a last resort for many families to send their kids. So our job was basically to play with them, love on them, and just be good role models for them. Now, the age demographics regarding these kids was a little different than the ages at camp that Camp Fuge sponsored. So these kids ranged from rising kindergartners all the way to rising 9th graders, meaning that some of them were my age or even a little older. The age demographics at the one sponsored by Fuge were a little younger, and I'll talk about them later. Anyways, the reason this is important is because as a track side is split up. So the rising 7th graders to rising 9th graders would take the elementary age kids, supervised by my youth pastor, while the rising 10th graders would take on the middle school age kids, supervised by the track leader. Of course, being rising freshmen, me and Jason went with the younger kids, while Austin as a rising senior went with the older kids. So we were split up here, but we would unite again soon. Now, these kids were a lot easier to work with than I expected. Pretty much the very moment they saw us, they immediately came running towards us. Like, I'm not even exaggerating when I say that 3 kids were hugging on me not even 5 seconds after we met. It was so adorable and made me realize that these kids looked up very highly to me, Jason, and the others, as well as made it easier to talk to them and get to know them. Now, this all took place in the gym's basketball court. So once everyone calmed down and got their hugs in, we played some basketball. Even though I still probably would have lost to these kids without going easy on them, I still went easy on them to boost their confidence and to make them happy. After about 45 minutes of that, it was time for the kids' silent reading time, so while they went to another room to read, me and the rest of the track group went back to the bus and ate lunch. The older kids also read during this time, so me, Jason, and Austin were reunited once again. Anyways, once that was over with, we went back to playtime. We then spent the next hour playing Duck Duck Goose. Afterwards, my youth pastor, for whatever reason, decided that it would be a good idea to teach these kids the fucking church clap. Why? Literally the worst part about Fuge other than being left on and bullied. And now we're about to teach these kids this shit? Why did we have to introduce them to this monstrosity? But to make matters even worse, we did this in the yoga room, which had all 4 walls as mirrors. Therefore, on top of having to do this dance, we also saw ourselves in the mirror doing it, making this probably the 3rd most embarrassing moment from this trip, only behind the rooming situation and an incident that took place that Thursday. Alright, so how we did this was that my youth pastor pulled up the song on his phone and connected his phone to the speaker. He then got me and the other track group members to get in the middle of the room, and of course did the dance. Just like the day before, I half-assed it. Jason, as well as really all the other boys in the group, also half-assed it too. But once we did the demonstration, we got the kids to do it with us. Seems like the kids were in a similar position as me and Jason, as they didn't really want to do it either, which actually surprised me because having as much energy as they did, I would expect them to dance harder than us. But they didn't and also half-assed it themselves, so at least it wasn't terrible since I could relate to the kids, but I still hated seeing myself in the mirror. By the way, you'll come to know that I have a huge hatred for mirrors and seeing myself. I don't know if it's because I'm ugly or what, but I despise seeing myself in the mirror or in pictures, which is why I never post many pictures of myself on Instagram or really anywhere unless it's for a shitpost. Afterwards, it was time for us to leave, so we said goodbye to the kids and then headed back to campus. Now, from the moment we got back from tracks to dinner, we were given free time. This might seem like a good part of the day, providing me with much needed rest and alone time after a rough day. However, this would end up being the worst part of the day for me. The reason is because since I was the 3rd roommate in a 2-person room, I did not have a key. As a result, I could not get into the room unless one of my roommates opened the door for me. This might not sound bad until you realize that my track group was usually the first group to get back, Meanwhile, both of my roommates were in the painting, construction, and yard work track, which was usually the last group to get back. This meant that I had to wait outside for the room for usually around 30 minutes before my roommates got back. During this time, the boys from my grade would go to their rooms after getting back from their tracks, making me vulnerable to bullying and harassment from them since it was the perfect place for them to do so. And that's exactly what happened here. As I was waiting for my roommates, the guys in my grade came back and did pretty much the same thing as the day before. They questioned me and laughed at me, calling me names, and just a bunch of other stuff that honestly wasn't too different from what the boys said back in 8th grade, which I went into more detail about in part 4. Honestly, it probably would have been better for me to just walk around campus during this time, as this would have allowed me to not only have to deal with them, but give me time away and to give me time by myself. I think the reason I didn't do this was because I was worried about the Fuge staff not letting me walk to my own room, since I knew they were just big on us being big together and all, but honestly, I should have just ignored that and gone my own. Besides, it wouldn't have hurt me anyways. I was almost 14, I was a lot more mature than others my age, and it would have been the perfect way to get away from those dipshits who revealed themselves to be fakes the day before. But at least once Preston and the other roommate arrived, I was finally able to relax and they unlocked the door and I could get away from the others. But nonetheless, I had to deal with this on this day, Thursday and Friday. I'll talk about what was different about Wednesday, as well as why Wednesday was the best day at Fusion, excluding the last day. After a little while though, it was time for dinner, so we then went over to the dining hall and ate. However, Preston and the other roommate decided to play a prank on me. So while I was getting a drink, they decided to loosen the salt dispenser. So when I tried to put salt on my green beans, the cap fell off and all the salt in the dispenser fell onto my green beans. We three then started laughing as I began cleaning up the mess. However, as I was getting another plate of green beans, a thought came to my mind: what if I put soda in my water bottle? So Mom and Dad brought with me a water bottle, since Nashville was especially super hot during summer. I brought this bottle with me during tracks, since the kids wore me out quite a bit, even if we were inside. They also brought with me a 6-pack case of Sundrop bottles, since I wanted to save them. So I decided why not put some orange crust in my water bottles. So I did that, but as I was doing it, this kid who looked about a year younger than me saw me and said, "Oh shit, I'm gonna do that myself," to his friends. They then all got their bottles and started filling up their bottles with soda. Even though this wasn't good for the bottle long term, it still allowed me to save sodas. I would then pour out the soda and replace it with my water every morning for tracks. Then at night, I would fill it up with soda, so it worked pretty well. After dinner, we had quite a bit of time until the night big ass sessions began. So the staff provided some outdoor toys like balls, jump ropes, and hula hoops for us to play with right outside the auditorium. Me, Preston, his sister, and the other roommate threw frisbee. We were just casually throwing the frisbee to each other when all of a sudden, Preston put a little too much force in his throw and ended up sending the frisbee flying. And by flying, I mean it went really far, like the length of an Olympic-sized pool far. However, it was not going far in the ideal direction, as it ended up going right towards the door to the auditorium. A few seconds later, it reached the door, but it didn't hit the door. Instead, a Fuge staff member was exiting the door and the frisbee hit him right in the face. Immediately upon making impact, Preston came over and asking the Fuge staff if he was okay, while me, his sister, and the other roommate came over and joined them. The staff member was really fine and was actually really cool about it, as he began laughing when he handed the frisbee back to Preston. Like he wasn't mad or anything, he just told us to be more careful since he understood this was an accident. So for the rest of our time throwing frisbee, we were a lot more careful, although we did joke about hitting someone in the face. A little while later, the auditorium doors opened up and we began the second big ass session, night big ass session. It pretty much went just like the one from the night before, where the band played some songs, part 2 of that video series was played, and the preacher gave a sermon. At least once that was over, we of course had our church group time, and then after it, we went to our dorms to sleep. Well, me, Preston, and the other roommate at least. The others of course stayed up all night since they had infinite energy. However, I found sleeping on this night in particular much easier than the night before, since I was starting to get into the flow of things and didn't have nearly as bad of a day as the day before. So with that, that brings us to Wednesday, June 20th. This was by far the best full day at Fuge, as I wouldn't have to deal with being harassed or bullied at all this day, and I'll explain how come in a little bit. Anyways, the other roommate did not set multiple alarms, as Preston woke him up as promised. I told them not to wake me up until 7:30, which they respected and went to breakfast while I slept in. Once they got back, they then woke me up and helped me get ready for the morning big ass session. Then after morning big ass session, we got together with our track groups and then went to a classroom, where our track leader gave his first lesson. Now, neither I, Austin, or Jason paid any bit of attention during this lesson. The reason is because June 20th, 2018 was a big day for Clash Royale. A new update was released that really changed the game forever. One of the main things was the switching of cards in the arena they unlocked. prior to this update, cards had never been swapped between arenas, so this was the first time this happened in the game's history. By the way, this is a year before seasons, so if you're confused as to why I don't just say seasons, that's why. But in addition, this was also the update that introduced the extra emotes. Prior to this update, we only had the 4 basic emotes, but this was the update that introduced more. So, as you can expect, this was a big deal for Clash Royale players, since this update affected every single player. So pretty much the whole time during the Bible study, me and Austin were playing double battles together and testing out our new cards, while Jason watched us. However, I also remember this Bible study for something outside of Clash Royale too. So once he wrapped up, our track leader introduced us to Mega Relay, a competition between each track that would take place Friday night. If you saw part 4, then you might remember Mega Relay from D Now. I didn't get to participate in it since I was injured, and I'll explain what I mean by that after I wrap up Fuge and talk for those who did not see part 4. But now at this point, I was almost fully recovered, as I could participate in it, which I'll get into more in detail when we get to Friday. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because we also created a chant similar to what we did back at D Now. Rather than a simple line like we did at D Now, our chant back at D Now was, if we want to be effective, then we have to be together, we instead took a song and rephrased it. That song in question was All Star by Smash Mouth, aka the Shrek song. We pretty much took the chorus of the song and replaced it with words referring to Mega Relay and Fuge. I don't remember the whole thing, but the lines I do remember were What's Up, Mega Relay, as well as Fuge Cup sure looks nice. I'm sorry everybody, but this one's ours. By the way, the Fuge Cup was this big gold trophy that was given to the track who won this event. I'll talk more about Mega Relay when we get to Friday, or Mega as I'll refer to it for the rest of the story time. But after that, we then went to our track site. Now the track site we went on this day, as well as on Thursday and Friday, was the one that Fuge sponsored. So it was not Hadley Park. I'm actually not too sure where this camp was, although I don't think I'd be too far off if I said that it was in either North or West Nashville, since Belmont's in South Nashville, and I remember us having a 20-minute drive. Anyways, this track site was actually a lot more different than the one before. One of the main reasons is that this site was purposely made for childcare, not a gym that also includes childcare. Additionally, the kids here were a lot younger, only ranging from rising kindergartners to rising 6th graders, meaning our younger track group members were at least a year older than the kids. This of course meant fewer kids, so we did not have to split our track group between younger and older kids. Therefore, I could play with the kids alongside Jason and Austin. Anyways, pretty much the moment we entered the camp, which is what I'll refer to the general building as, all the kids pretty much treated us like the kids back at Hadley Park and came running over to us and hugged us. Once again, it was really sweet and adorable. Afterwards, the camp leader came over and welcomed us. She was really young, being only 15 years old, making her younger than a lot of members in her track group, including Austin. But she thanked us for helping her out, since being a 15-year-old girl trying to watch over 30 elementary schoolers is probably more difficult than I can even imagine. Now, honestly, I don't really remember too much to happen on this day in particular in regards to tracks other than me, Jason, and Austin collectively getting our name tags stuck on a basketball goal. Luckily, Austin was really tall, so he was able to jump up and get his as well as ours down for us. But other than that, I don't really remember much from tracks on this day. But after a few hours, we made our way back to campus. Now instead of going back to our dorms like we usually did, we instead did something different as a church on this day. So when we got back from tracks, we were ordered to go immediately to the coach bus, so I did that. Seems like the painting, construction, and yard work track got back early on this day, as Preston, his sister, and the other roommate were already on the bus, so I made my way over and took a seat beside Preston's sister. This was definitely the ideal thing to happen, as of course this meant that I did not have to deal with being laughed at or bullied since I didn't have to wait outside my door wondering when my roommates would come. Anyways, for the next 30 minutes or so, Preston's sister and I played Clash Royale together, as she was also getting acquainted with the new update and everything. Then once everyone was on the bus, we made our way over to where we were going to go. That place of question, downtown Nashville. Belmont isn't too far from downtown, so pretty soon we arrived. Once we arrived, we were then paired into small groups where each led by a youth leader. Me, Preston, his sister, and the other roommate went with the middle school boys small group leader, whose house I went to every Monday night throughout 8th grade. I'll talk more about small groups when we get to September. But for now, we five just explored downtown Nashville. I remember us getting our picture taken by the Cumberland River, as well as a picture with the Nashville skyline behind us. Afterwards, we as a church went to this Italian restaurant. We four, meaning less our leader, sat at a booth together. We forged a large pizza and ate some breadsticks. Overall, it was a nice dinner. Then once we finished, we made our way back to Belmont and attended the night big ass session. Now, thankfully, this big-ass session was a lot shorter than the one from the previous 2 nights, as after it, we did a thing called nightlife. Honestly, I can't really explain nightlife all too well, since we only did nightlife on 2 nights and both nights were very different from one another, but I can at least explain what we did, so I'll do that. Anyways, on this night in particular, we pretty much discussed places where Christianity is under attack. We had a missionary who planted an underground church in Jakarta, Indonesia, came and explained the dangers of being a Christian in Indonesia and other places where Christianity is under attack. He also talked about the success of his church and other underground churches and how they're bringing people in despite rampant persecution from the government. Here in America, I noticed many church leaders, particularly evangelicals in my old church, talk about how Christianity is under attack in America and how Christians are under so much persecution by the government and people. Which, don't get me wrong, there are actual cases of Christian persecution in America, but the types of persecution these leaders are talking about are really ridiculous and very petty. If these leaders want to talk about real Christian persecution, they need to talk to this pastor who spoke to us at Fuge, since he knew and saw real persecution. Like, if the government over there found out about him and what he was doing, they would have had him beheaded. That's real persecution. Not being talked badly about because your church left me out at Fuge and laughed at me for it, and then proceeded to preach hateful sermons and cherry-pick scripture. Thank God I don't go to that church anymore. Thank God I left the Southern Baptist denomination entirely. But getting back to that missionary, he honestly should be used as a role model for all church leaders, as what he's doing is incredibly brave and shows just how much faith he has, especially to go to a country where Christians are killed for their faith and preach the word of God. I really hope he's still doing well today, and I hope his church in Jakarta is getting larger and larger, but still unknown to the Indonesian authorities. But after nightlife, we had church group time, and then after that, we went to our dorms. I had an even easier time falling asleep that night since not only was it warmer night and the others didn't make as much noise, but I just genuinely had a good day. It was the only good full day I had at Fuge since I didn't have to interact with the guys in my grade and didn't have to wait outside my room. However, the next day, being Thursday, June 21st, I had by far the worst full day at Fuge. I already anticipated this day to be bad, as it was my 14th birthday. Even though the whole rooming situation occurred, I knew that this was going to be a tough day since my church knew about my birthday, so I decided to keep it personal and told myself that I would instead celebrate it when I got home on Saturday, June 23rd. I did end up doing that and ended up having one of the best days ever, which I'll get to when we get there. But for now, I was stuck surviving my actual birthday, and unfortunately, it would end up being a far worse day than I expected, almost just as bad as the day we arrived. Anyways, Preston woke me up at 7:30 that morning, and after getting ready, we went to the morning big ass session together. Afterwards, I got together with my track group and then we did our Bible study. Same thing as before, as me and Jason and Austin spent our time playing Clash Royale. Then we went off to our track sites. Now, thankfully, the first hour was uneventful. However, when it came time for lunch, my worst fucking nightmare came true. My youth pastor announced to everyone in the track that it was my birthday, and then everyone got to sing me happy birthday. Now, in part 1, I talked about how much I hated and still hate the happy birthday song. It's always made me feel really embarrassed, and still makes me, and when someone swings it to me today. Which is also why I usually don't announce my birthday whenever June 21st rolls around. For example, on my 4th birthday, even though it was 15 years ago, I still remember hiding under the table when my parents tried to sing it. And then on my 5th birthday, I ran out of our playground when they did it. Since then, they stopped singing me happy birthday, and at this point, I had not been sung happy birthday to in 9 years. But this was the day that streak ended, as my track sang me happy birthday. Now, even though I was very upset, I wasn't all too mad, given how well the track members treated me over the past couple of days. In fact, when Jason and Austin noticed I wasn't feeling comfortable, they stopped singing it out of respect. Ultimately though, I forgave everyone since they were all super nice people and didn't mean to make me upset. However, this wouldn't be the first time this happened, as it would happen again, but it would be 1,000 times worse. After that, the rest of our tracks was uneventful, so after a little while, we made our way back to campus. However, this meant that I was back to having to wait outside the room until one of my roommates arrived. Of course, just like what happened on Tuesday, the guys in my grade started harassing and making fun of me until eventually my roommates came in. However, unlike Tuesday when they pretty much left when we shut and locked the door, they did not stop when they arrived. In fact, right after we locked the door, they were trying to get into our room, banging on our door, and just being the most obnoxious, most stupid-ass fucking pieces of shit they could be. Albeit, they were also targeting the other roommate, not Preston, since I'd eventually learned that he was also a target of their bullshit. But ultimately, what we three decided to do was just ignore them and hope they would get bored. Sure enough, they did and went off after 30 minutes of us ignoring them. Preston even said that he wished that he brought a shovel he used during that day and during tracks to beat them up, to which me and the other roommate wholeheartedly agree, as those guys 100% deserve to get the shit beat out of them. Then for really the rest of the night until church group time, things were normal. Me and my roommate hung out in the room. Me and my roommates hung out in the room. We didn't eat dinner, threw frisbee, did the night big ass session, and did nightlife after it. Although I don't really remember what we did for nightlife. However, church group time on this day would prove to be the second worst part of the entire trip, only behind the rooming situation. It'd also be what really sparked the conflict at church, from being a simple situation involving me being left out and bullied, to me fully hating everything about my church and realizing just how full of shit it is. It would also go on to spark religious trauma and also make me turn away from church and almost religion entirely. So, the first 3 quarters were normal. Our youth pastor gave us a lesson, and then he split us into smaller groups. However, that's when he came over to me and asked me to come with him. He needed to use the bathroom and wanted someone to watch over his stuff for him, which was a rather unusual request since he could have just let his wife or another youth leader, rather than random old me do it for him. But I obliged and went with him. After he finished up, I handed him his stuff and we went back to the classroom. Only when we arrived, the classroom was pitch black, so I was wondering where everyone was. That's when the light turned on, and everyone jumped up and started singing Happy Birthday. Now, for birthdays, my church would often sing a short version of the Happy Birthday that actually wasn't all that bad, although it still often made me uncomfortable. But this time, they sang that normal Happy Birthday song, which made me super uncomfortable and also incredibly mad inside, since even if I controlled my anger, I didn't show it. But what really made me mad about what the people were singing was the loudest were the guys from my grade. Yeah, after all the bullshit that they put me through since the first day of Fuge, from leaving me out to laughing at me to being obnoxious to me and my roommates, they now apparently want to wish me a happy birthday and want to welcome me in? That's gotta be the fakest and most uncool thing you could do. Yeah, fuck them and their fake ass bullshit. In fact, I go as far as to say that they're worse than the bullies from 8th grade, because at least they genuinely meant what they said and didn't try to fake it. Well, these guys in my grade at church were literally wearing a facade, albeit horribly, and they thought I was stupid enough to not notice. Yeah, they can go fuck themselves. And the church wonders why they're losing members and why people despise religion in church. It's because there's members it's because their members do stuff like this and try to fake it, just like how their leaders sexually abuse kids and try to cover it up. Now, thankfully, although most people were singing, Preston, his sister, and the other roommate were not, since they knew just how much I hated this song after I told them what happened during tracks. So I do have to give them and my three my utmost gratitude for being respectful and actually caring for me, unlike all the guys in my grade. And listen, I know it might sound like I'm going off the edge here, but I'm not actually mad about my church singing me happy birthday. What I'm upset about is that they did it literally 3 days after leaving me out, as well as after making fun of me and bullying me. It's just so obvious that they were being fake, and for some reason, they thought I wouldn't know. This ultimately be what made the conflict at church go from mild to very severe. A little while later though, we were done and could go back to our dorms. However, as I was leaving the classroom, my youth pastor asked if I were to walk with him. I went along with him and walked to the dorm with him, albeit taking the long route. I'm actually really glad he did this, since I was terrified about going back to my dorm, since I was worried that I was going to get made fun of and harassed by the guys in my grade. As for why he wanted to walk with me, well, he kind of just wanted to go over about how my day was, as well as pretty much all that I did at 13 years old. We started by just talking about my day. When he asked me how I felt about the surprise, I was honest and told him that I just was really embarrassed and uncomfortable, although I didn't mention being pissed off at the guys in my grade. He apologized for all of it and promised next time that my birthday rolled around, he wouldn't do it again, which I thanked him for, even if I would never be around anyone from my church for any future birthday, to which I'll explain why in part 6. Now, as for how he even knew my birthday, since I didn't tell him nor wanted to, I would find that out 4 years later. Apparently, Mom told him that my birthday was on the 21st. I have no idea what the hell Mom was thinking, since she knew how much I hated the happy birthday song, given how she always likes bringing up old stories about me running away whenever the song was sung and embarrassed me. I don't know if she never learned her lesson from those stories or what, but pretty much Mom was the reason all this happens. If she didn't tell my youth pastor, I wouldn't have had the dreadful day that I had here. Afterwards, me and my youth pastor drifted into reflection and started talking about what all I did at 13 years old, because my god did a lot happen at this age. In fact, I'd argue this was the most eventful as well as the most important age for me. I went to great detail about it in part 4, but I grew a ton at 13. Like, if you were to compare me on my 13th birthday back in 2017 to my 14th in 2018, you'd have two completely different people, as I went through that much at 13 as well as throughout 8th grade. That's why part 4 had to be split into 2 parts, since if I did it in one, it would have been over 5 hours long. But that just comes to show what all happened, so there's a lot to look over. Afterwards, we made it to the dorm. My youth pastor said goodbye, and then I went up to my dorm to get some sleep, finally putting an end to the worst birthday I've ever had. That then brings me to the last full day of Fuge, being Friday, June 22nd. While not a good day, it definitely wasn't bad. It certainly wasn't as bad as Monday or Thursday, although not a good day like Wednesday or Saturday. Anyways, just like the past few mornings, Preston woke me up at 7:30 and then we went to the morning big ass session. Afterwards, we did our Bible study with our track groups, as well as practice our chant, since that night was when we would participate in Mega, which I'll get to later. We then went to our track sites and played with the kids one more time. When we left, some kids and even some track members started getting emotional. Even I was quite sad, since these kids were really sweet and I really loved them. I hope they're all doing well today and whatever issues they had at home were resolved, as they're all probably teens and maybe some of them have graduated by now. Afterwards, we made it back to campus, where I of course had to be stuck waiting for my roommates while everyone else who passed by me made fun of me and laughed at me. Thankfully, this was the last time this happened, but it still sucked. Then a little while later, we ate dinner and attended the last night big ass session of the trip. Afterwards, we went straight to church group time quite early, as we were going to do Mega after it. Thankfully, this church group time was forgettable and normal, and nobody seemed to remember the night before, so that made time go by much easier. Afterwards, we as a church then walked over to a field beside the basketball stadium, where all the track group leaders were waving their flags. I went over and united with mine. Once everyone was settled, an announcer came to the center since the tracks all formed a large circle and started hyping everyone up. Then each track took their turns doing their chant. While it was our turn, me and the track did our chant that we practiced. Well, they did. I just jumped with them but didn't sing since we all know how much I hate singing, but I still jumped with them. It was extremely cringy and honestly not something I enjoy looking back on, but it was still better than ruining the situation or my birthday. Once all the tracks did their chant, we then were allowed into the basketball stadium, where Mega was set up and took place. Now, entering the basketball stadium was ironically the most memorable part about Mega. For as long as Storytime 7 back in February of 2021, I've always compared walking onto the stadium like jumps from Pokemon Sword and Shield, where the player enters a large tunnel and then enters onto a huge field with the crowd watching over him or her, while the gym leader is waiting on the other side. Even though Generation 8 is by far the worst Pokemon generation, I do have to give it to Gen 8 for having the best gyms for the unique stadium-themed jumps. Kick-ass gym leader battle theme, especially when the gym leader's on their last Pokemon and the crowd starts cheering on the player, and the more minor stuff like walking through the tunnel. But getting back to Fuge, that's actually how Mega felt, as all of us walked onto the court from a tunnel into a large court. Just that there was a year and a half before Sword and Shield were released, as well as to no spectators, so we didn't have a crowd cheering us on. Anyways, as for what we did during Mega, I'm sorry to disappoint, but I don't really remember too much. Which, I mean, I kinda have an excuse for this, as the day before as well as following the day were so eventful and greatly overshadowed this day that I don't really remember Mega very much. However, I do recall one moment where we were pulling a rope, and both me and Austin lost a shoe. But we were also were both still trying to get the rope pulled, so we just kept pulling and even without missing a shoe. At least once we finished and what we were trying to do, Austin got both our shoes back, but nonetheless, it was still pretty funny, especially by the fact that both of us lost a shoe at the same time. But once the event finished, they announced who won. I don't remember which track won or even how they determined the winner. All I remember is that my track didn't win. But afterwards, we then all made our way back to dorms and went to bed. Before I went off, I said one last goodbye to Jason and Austin, and then I rejoined Preston and the other roommate and went to our room. That was the last time I saw or heard from Jason and Austin. I really hope they're both doing well, which I'm sure they are since they both were incredible people. When we got back to the room, me, Preston, and the other roommate got most of our stuff packed, and then we headed off to sleep. Then that brings me to the last day of Fuge, being Saturday, June 23rd, 2018. This was not only the best day at Fuge, but one of the best days in my entire life. When it comes to the best days in my life, I have two tiers for them, the amazing and the supernatural tiers. The amazing tier includes days like March 13th, 2018, which was the day I got discharged from the mental hospital, which I touched on part 4, March 23rd, 2019, which I'll talk about later in the story time, and May 21st, 2021, my last day of 11th grade, which I'll talk about in part 7. Meanwhile, the supernatural tier consists of days that were absolutely amazing and everything goes 100% right, and just truly amazing days in general, which include but are not limited to June 7th, 2016, which was my last day of 6th grade, discussed in part 2, April 14th, 2018, which was the day I gave my life to Christ, mentioned in part 4, and December 10th, 2021, my very last day of school, which I'll talk about in part 8. June 23rd, 2018 falls in the supernatural tier because it really was that good of a day. In fact, it's usually the first day that comes to mind when thinking about post-depression period part 1. So with that, let's talk about this kick-ass day. So, unlike the previous few days, I had to get up at 6:30 since we had to load the bus at 7:30, so Preston woke me up a little early. We didn't have to do a whole lot since we packed most of our stuff the night before, but we still had to get our bed sheets and other sleeping stuff. Once we got that, I then also had to bring my mattress to the dorm my youth pastor stayed in. He helped me with it, so I didn't have to deal with anyone making fun of me. Once everyone was packed up, we then loaded the bus as well as got our seats filled up. I sat beside Preston's sisters on the way back home. But before we could leave, we had to do one more thing, attend the last big-ass session. So we all made our way to the auditorium and finished the final big-ass session of the trip. Everyone was all bummed out about Fuge being over and having to go back home. Meanwhile, I on the other hand was excited and ready to go back home. After enduring all that I did, I was ready to finally have privacy, freedom, not worrying about being laughed at, being able to celebrate my birthday in peace, catching up on sleep, and most importantly, getting away from people. I don't think my social battery has ever drained as much as it did at Fuge, so I was ready to finally have some time to myself and be away from my church. And after that, after the big-ass session was wrapped up, we boarded the bus and headed back home. The ride home wasn't nearly as memorable as the ride up there, although I do remember me and Preston's sisters playing some more Clash Royale on the way home. I also remember us stopping at Chick-fil-A halfway there and eating lunch. But then, at around 6:45 due to traffic, we finally arrived back at church. Mom, Dad, and Zoe were waiting for me. So once they got everyone's luggage out the bus, I found mine and loaded it onto their van, and then we headed back home. Now, unlike camp 3 years earlier where I immediately told them that I had a bad experience, I didn't mention the rooming situation at all. In fact, I didn't even think it was until I wrote and recorded Storytime 7 when my parents found out what happened at Fuge, since I've always been very hesitant to tell them stuff like this. Instead, I mostly talked about tracks, mentioning Jason and Austin and told them what all we did. Once we got home, they let me have about an hour to myself to relax, so I went to my room and on my bed, I saw a bunch of birthday gifts, including a $15 iTunes card, some headphones, a copy of Pokemon Ultra Moon, and a bag of Doritos. I also had quite a few letters that included some money from relatives. I then spent the next hour just relaxing on my bed. To say that I felt relieved to be home would be an understatement, as I was so glad to be back home and not at Fuge. However, that's when I remembered something. BTD 6 was out, and since I had money, might as well get it. So I'd been a Bloons Tower Defense player for a couple of years at this point. It's honestly one of those series that I come back to and then leave ever so often. I use BTD 6 as well as Bloons Monkey City gameplay all the time when I used to have gameplay over story times. Although I haven't played the game since early 2022, but I still really enjoyed the series. Anyways, I purchased the games until the iTunes card and spent the next 30 minutes playing it. This game felt absolutely magical because before it was released, I loved theorizing the different tier 5 upgrades and third pass that BTD 6 towers could have, or BTD 5 towers. And to make things even cooler, some of my ideas were actually added to the game. For example, I always theorized that a cool third tier 3 path for the Dart Monkey would be to use a crossbow that gave him a higher piercing, and sure enough, that ended up being the Dart Monkey's new tier 3 path, which felt incredibly magical to use. A little while later, though, Dad came into my room and told me that burgers were up, so I joined him, Mom, and Zoe outside by our pool and we ate some burgers. While eating, we also talked about what all we wanted to accomplish this upcoming school year. Even though it might have seemed too early to discuss the school year, I was going back to school since early college started in early August and ended 2 weeks before Memorial Day. Well, 1 week before Memorial Day. So it was actually coming up pretty quickly. We talked about it some, and then Mom and Dad brought up an incentive. If I make A's and B's this year, they would buy me a Switch. This was an interesting incentive, since they usually expected all A's for a reward, which is what happened in 6th grade as well as what made June 7, 2016 such an awesome day. But since I was going to be taking college courses at only 14 years old, it kind of made sense. I'll talk about how well I did throughout the story time, and I'll discuss it if I got that Switch or not at the very beginning of part 6. Now, another really cool thing during our dinner was that there was still sun outside. Like, even at 9 o'clock, the sun had still not set yet, since this was the longest day of the year. I'm pretty sure it did eventually set at 9:30, but still, it was cool being by the pool at 9 while eating and it was still bright outside. But once we finished, we then had the rest of the night to ourselves. I ended up staying up to 3 a.m. playing BTD 6, all while listening to music and just feeling great that Fuge was over. And with that, one of the best days of my life was over. Even though this day was probably the least eventful of the supernatural tier, June 23rd, 2018 still stands as a phenomenal day and is often the day I think about whenever I think about Post-Depression Period Part 1, since it really did showcase just how amazing this time period was, as well as a day I often think about when I hear the phrase the good old days. It truly was a good day, and a day that I think will forever represent the good part of my teenage years, as well as just being the best day of the best summer of my life. And with that, I'm finally done discussing Fuge. Fuge 2018 was a very important event for me in both good and bad ways. It was good because I met some amazing people in my tracks as well as met Preston, and when I got back home, I got to have an amazing day that I consider to be one of the best days of the best day of the best summer of my life. However, there were of course bad parts about Fuge, especially when I learned that my church had actually been wearing a facade for a whole year and really didn't care about me. I learned that the guys in my grade that I had grown so close to were actually fakes who ultimately treated me worse than the bullies from 8th grade. However, I wasn't just yet done with them, as I still wanted to forgive them and still be friends with them. I would attempt to hang out with them and continue to be friends for the rest of the summer, as well as throughout my time as a freshman, even if I no longer went to their school anymore. But I'll just go ahead and mention that this was not successful, as many awful things came out of this situation, with the main two being Winter Retreat 2019, which I'll talk about when we get to January, and me being sexually harassed, which I'll discuss when we get to March. So yeah, Fuge is now over. My family went to church without me the next day, as I needed to catch up on sleep as well as alone time. In fact, I did not even interact with anyone that Sunday or even leave my room except to use the bathroom or get a snack. So the 24th was also a pretty good day that provided me time to relax. But the next day would be when important days started to pick back up, as on Monday, June 25th, 2018, I officially returned to swimming. In part 4, I talked about how I broke both of my arms by jumping over a tennis net. Really funny story, but to give you all the gist, I'd had surgery on my left arm since I completely shattered it, while my right arm didn't need too much work since I only had minor fractions on it. Now, this injury of course meant that I could now swim. Now that this injury of course meant that I could no longer swim. So, for those who haven't seen parts 2, 3, or 4, it means that we started swimming for a local competitive swim club at the end of my 6th grade school year, 3rd grade school year for her. We thoroughly enjoyed swimming and stayed with the team. We made friends, got stronger, and all around enjoyed the sport. Even in September 2017, when we got a new coach who was an asshole that worshipped the sport, we still enjoyed it. Speaking of which, this coach was an annoying ass motherfucker throughout the time that my arms were broken. Almost every other day, he would consistently ask Mom when I would be going back to swimming and never asked about my arm or how I was doing. Every time, Mom would just tell him that she didn't know, which is true since we didn't know when I would be able to swim. It also only pissed both of us off since it of course showed that my coach only cared about me swimming and not how well I was doing. Like in part 4, I mentioned that had my suicide attempt been successful, my coach likely would have been upset that the team membership decreased rather than upset that a team member died. And unfortunately, it's reasonable for me to think that, as my coach was literally that bad and heartless. At least during our May 31st appointment, my pediatrician told me that I would be fine getting back into competitive swimming 3 weeks after the appointment. So by the time I got back from Fuge, I could go back to swimming. And that's exactly what happened on Monday, June 25th. That night, I attended my first practice since March. At first, it felt really nice to be back in the water, and the rest of the team was excited to see me back. Mom was quite excited too, as she watched for the entire practice, took pictures, and even cheered me on occasionally. I too was quite excited since I was back to doing what I enjoyed. However, that was the first maybe 15 minutes of practice. For the rest of the practice, our coach decided to make this a really difficult practice, including butterfly, endurance, and fast sets that I could tell were made specifically to fuck with me. Like, I'm not kidding when I say that this was one of the most difficult practices I've ever had as a swimmer. And the worst part is that I know why he made this practice so difficult, since it was clear that he was targeting me. Any coach will tell you that you should not push players too much when they return to the sport after a long break, especially if that break was because of an injury, as in my case. But considering my coach was a dickhead, he didn't care that I was returning to swimming after 3 months, as he made his such a difficult practice for the sole purpose of quote-unquote making up missed practices. By the way, my coach was big on attendance and expected everyone to attend all 5 practices per week, which was really ignorant considering we all had lives outside of swimming, and it was especially ignorant in my case since I was still trying to get back into the groove of things. Therefore, I only attended two and sometimes only 1 practice a week during this time, which really pissed my coach off, but did make a more relaxing and a better summer for me. But at least I got that 1 practice down and was back to swimming. I went to swim in any meets that summer, so I won't be explaining each one like I did in part 4 when discussing the summer of 2017, although I did swim a meet in November, which I'll get to later in the story time. So with that finished, that pretty much wraps up June 2018. This was a huge month, with me finishing the hardest and most challenging school year ever, to all the church drama and started as a result of Fuge, to finally getting back to swimming. I had a big month. So let's move on to a more relaxed, but still a super good month, being July 2018. Not too much happened during this month, which is a good thing since that meant that I got to relax. So to start, let's discuss my final appointment with the pediatrician, which took place on Thursday, July 12th. That morning, Mom drove me up to his office in South Charlotte and we got checked in. We did one last x-ray and afterwards, my pediatrician told me that I was pretty much perfectly healed. Of course, the damage in my left arm was so severe that I would never regain its full strength back, which I can confirm 5 years later that my left arm still can't bend as far or use as much force as it does in my right arm. But of course, this still was the case for the rest of my life. But nonetheless, I still regained roughly 95% of my strength back on it, so it works very well when I don't even have any issues with it. So I consider this appointment to be the appointment that I officially fully recovered after breaking my arms, as that's when my pediatrician gave me the notice that my arm was fully healed. Me and Mom thanked him, and after the meeting, I was finally done visiting his office. Now, the day after our appointment, we headed off to the beach for 8 days. We did the same thing we did the previous 2 years, where we rented out a beach home for a week in North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and stayed there. Overall, I had a good trip. However, the main thing I want to discuss regarding this trip would be my return to YouTube. So in part 4, I talked about taking a 4-month break from YouTube, which, by the way, I've been doing YouTube for over 7 years, and this is still the longest break I have ever taken from YouTube in the whole 7 years I've been recording videos and live streaming. But as time went on, I began to miss doing YouTube and felt that I was ready to get back to it. So during our session a week prior, me and my therapist talked about it, and we decided that was in the spot to go back to doing YouTube. However, I was not to go back to recording a bunch of videos and going back to the whole drama that I was involved in back in March. So we decided that for my restrictions, I would be limited to 1 video a week and I had to disable comments. So that's what I began doing on July 14th, from then all the way to June of 2019, which would be when I felt that I was in a better spot to remove these restrictions. I'll talk about that in part 6, but by recording once a week as well as disabling comments, this made it difficult for the YouTuber who sent me death threats earlier in the month to continue doing these. And ultimately, it worked, as I never received another death threat from him, and a year later, he would meet his downfall, which I'll touch on in part 6. Now, although these restrictions were good for me, they were not very good for my video quality. Prior to taking my break, I recorded walkthrough gameplay videos of a video game called The Diplomat, which for those who haven't been around my channel for that long, I explained this game series much more in depth in part 3, so I recommend watching it. I also did other series related to the games, with my most notable being the Diplomat 3 Coliseum series, which is what brought me to fame in the community. But getting back on topic, this meant that I can not record walkthrough series like I'd been doing since I started my YouTube channel back in 2016. Additionally, I lost my interest in the series as a whole and all that happened as a result of March and how toxic the community is. By the way, the Diplomat community might be small, but it rivals communities like Smash Bros and My Hero Academia in terms of toxicity, with part 4 being very good proof of that. However, during this time, my interest in Pokemon was getting greater and greater. Even though my first Pokemon game was Pokemon Platinum, which I played back in 2009, and I watched my first Pokemon anime, Diamond and Pearl, at the same time, I had never had a real interest in the games. I had somewhat of an interest in the series again when I played Alpha Sapphire in 2014, where I was introduced to and chose my now favorite Pokemon ever, my channel mascot, Mudkip, but I never really had a real interest, if you know what I mean. But during this time, I was playing through Ultra Moon and found myself really interested in this series, as I thoroughly enjoyed the game and I still consider Ultra Sun and Moon as my second favorite games in the series, only behind Platinum. So therefore, my channel started to be centered around Pokemon games, where I would record videos of me beating tough opponents, whether it be champions or notably really difficult battles like Ultra Necrozma and Ultra Sun and Moon. I began uploading videos of me doing these battles, and let's just say that they were probably some of the cringiest videos I've ever made. Even though I'd never spoken in these videos, they were still really bad quality, were rushed, and not very interesting. And this is what I uploaded from then all the way until June of 2019. But that's pretty much how my channel worked during this time. Every Friday, or sometimes every other Friday, I would release a Pokemon video and it would of course be cringy as hell, but at least it kept my channel active until I fully returned without any restrictions in 2019. While at the beach, I recorded 2 videos since I was there for 2 Fridays. Nothing really to comment on them, just that they were both quite cringy and not videos I enjoy looking back on. Anyways, my time during the beach itself, outside of recording the 2 videos, was fun. Spent some time by the ocean now that I had my doctor's approval, got to explore the area some, and even went go-kart racing with Dad at one point. I also got a full week break from swimming as well, which also felt really nice. So yeah, I had a good trip. Then once we got back, I literally had only 2 more practices before swimming let out for a month. So how year-long competitive swimming works is that during the month of August, teams get a month-long break from swimming so that we can go back to school and get used to our new schedules. When we return during the second week of September, we begin the short course season, where we would swim 20 meets and 25-yard pools from then until March, whereas from April to July, we had the long course season where we swam meets and 50-meter pools. I talked more about this in part 4 since I swam in both a long course and short course season, but for this story time, just know that from the end of July to the second week of September, we had our break month, meaning no swimming. Now, one last thing before I finish discussing July, I also attended this one-day church trip near the end of the month where we went and played kick golf, which is golf but with kickballs. Obviously, it's nowhere near as memorable as Fuge, but I remember it being because it was where I met a rising 7th grader who just so happened to same name as me. Yep, his name was also Zach. Just by that characteristic alone, we pretty much instantly became friends, since when 2 guys have the same name, they become friends instantly. And with that finish, that about wraps up July. Despite not a whole lot occurring that month, July was still a great month for me since I got quite a bit of rest, officially recovered from my broken arms, and even returned to YouTube. So with that, let's move on to August, a much more eventful month. Now, as stated before, my new school started back much earlier than my old school did. In fact, my first day was on Monday, August 6th, meaning that discussing this month in terms of that summer isn't going to take too long. In fact, nothing really happened until the weekend before school began. As for what happened that weekend, me and my family took a trip to Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm not too sure where or who gave them to her, but Mom ended up getting coupons to see both the Creation Museum and Noah's Ark Recreation, both of which are in northern Kentucky and within the Cincinnati metro area. So we decided to use them from Friday, August 3rd to Sunday, August 5th. Now, this was also a pretty cool trip since it was my first of only two times in the Midwest. The other time was actually this past July when I returned to Ohio with my grandmother, who was originally from and grew up in Cincinnati, and put flowers on her parents' and siblings' graves. It was a sweet trip, and if I ever do a series like this for college, maybe a year or 2 after I graduate, so perhaps 2025 or 2026, I'll talk about it in part 4 of that series. Anyways, Cincinnati is quite a long drive, being roughly 7-hour drive, give or take an hour depending on how rough weather is in the mountains of western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and how bad traffic is in Asheville, Knoxville, and Lexington. So, that Friday, we packed up the van and headed off to Cincinnati. The trip up there wasn't really too bad. That is until we hit Lexington. For whatever reason, the GPS took us off I-75 and put us on a back road, and we ended up taking it all the way to Cincinnati. No idea why that was the case, but it was. But there was at least one super cool thing to talk about taking this back road, and that was the fact that to enter into Ohio, whose border with Kentucky is split by the Ohio River, we took a ferry. So Dad paid a small fee, and we got to board a ferry that allowed us to cross the river and allowed me to enter the state of Ohio for the first time. It didn't take long afterwards for us to reach the hotel. Once we got there, we were able to get settled. That was until we saw some familiar faces. It just so happened that my uncle and his 2 kids from Delaware decided they want to join us, so they flew over, and as a result, we got to hang out with them on this trip too. Anyways, we all got settled, and afterwards, we hit the road again and head off to the Creation Museum. Well, it wasn't too long of a trip since the Creation Museum is in Petersburg, Kentucky, which is a suburb of Cincinnati that's right across the Ohio River from both Ohio and Indiana. In fact, our route actually took us onto Indiana, and we entered the museum by taking a bridge crossing the Ohio River, so I also got to knock off Indiana as a state I've been to. Anyways, the Creation Museum is basically a huge museum dedicated to creationism, which, for those not familiar with the Bible, this is the story about how God created the heaven and earth. So pretty much the first couple of chapters in Genesis. So we pretty much got to explore how the earth was created, and also got to learn about some arguments against creationism, and the defenses Christian scholars give for these criticisms. As for what I did exactly, I don't remember too much. I'm pretty sure me, my sister, and cousins were allowed to wander around together while our parents did their thing. Afterwards, we ate dinner, and then headed back to the hotel and slept there. The next day, we had a longer trip than the Creation Museum, as we went to the Ark Encounter in Williamstown, Kentucky, roughly the halfway point between Lexington and Cincinnati. The Ark Encounter is pretty much this huge 1-to-1 scale of Noah's Ark, and using almost exactly the same dimensions as God gave Noah to build his ark, and also explain the story and how Noah, his family, and how all the animals survived in the ark for 50 days. This was a really cool visit since we got to see what it was like on the ark, since they also had animals and even other unique features that made this thing seem like a real ark. There was also a petting zoo outside the ark that we visited too. Overall, a really cool visit. I didn't remember us heading back to Cincinnati. The van was running low on gas, so Dad stopped at a gas station to refill. However, as he was refilling the van, it started to pour down extremely heavy, like so heavy that it was actually not safe for us to drive. The gas station we were at was in Covington, Kentucky, which is literally across the river from downtown Cincinnati. This gas station also happened to be right in front of the river and had a really nice view of the Cincinnati skyline, so we spent the next 45 minutes watching the rain pour over the city and fill up the river. At least once the rain calmed down, we were able to cross the river and get back to our hotel. Other than that, nothing too crazy happened on this trip. Overall, it was a nice, relaxing, and fun trip and a great way to wrap up the best summer of my life. And with that brings me to Monday, August 6, 2018, being my first of not only my 9th grade school year, but my first day of high school. Now, before I talk about this day, I should talk about my new school structure. So being in early college, we also took college classes in addition to high school classes. Our school was connected to the local community college, so even though our actual school size was small, we had access to a relatively large campus. I wouldn't have any classes outside the building my school was in this semester, so I won't talk about the whole community college, this school year. So I won't talk about the whole community college's campus entirely in this story time. Although we'll talk more about in part 6 and 7 since I did have classes in other buildings. Now, for the building my school was in, my school took up roughly 3/4 of the first floor. As mentioned, it was just a square. Being such a small high school with only 180 students total, including 55 of us freshmen, we didn't really need much. You'd of course start in the front office, and then as you left, you'd enter the square. To the right of the office was the freshman hallway, which included all the freshman lockers and classroom, also where I spent most of my time this school year. Once you walk to the end of the hallway, you'll reach the upperclassmen hallway, where the sophomores had their lockers and where the upperclassmen classrooms were. Then once you walked down it, you had 2 places to go. Outside, which took you back to the took you to the back of the school, or front if you approached the school coming from my place since I left east of the school, or you could take a left. When you took a left, you'd see all the junior lockers as well as the cafeteria. We called the lockers the multi-purpose room since we often used it as a meeting room whenever we as a grade or school needed to get together. We also used it as the drop-off area in the mornings and where the bus riders would wait for their bus to get them. By the way, my school utilized 4 buses and took students from early college to the high school they were supposed to go to. In the mornings, the buses would pick us up at their respective high schools. Therefore, once the public schools went into session, how arrival to school worked was that my grandmother would first take Zoe to school, who's in 6th grade and went to the intermediate school, and then she would drive me over to the high school, where I would board the bus and would take me over to early college. Then for dismissal, the bus would take me back to the public high school, and I would either walk over to the natatorium for swim practice, or if I didn't have practice, either mom or my grandmother would pick me up. Now, going back to the structure of my high school, you then had a hallway that completed the square and made it so that you could walk from the multi-purpose room back to the office. Now, in between the square, you had mostly labs and storage areas, as well as a bathroom by the freshman hallway. I know I'm going to go in a lot more detail about the school than I did about my other schools, but the reason is because I'm going to be discussing the school for the rest of the series and bring up all these classrooms and features, so I figured I'd go into more detail here. So that pretty much describes my school's architecture. I find it fun to compare my school to Zoe's, who goes to a public high school I would have gone to had I not gone to early college. Her school's campus is huge, and I believe her school has roughly 1,500 students, which is over 8 times the size of mine. They also have sports while my school didn't. Another benefit of my high school since most of the boys from 8th grade, as well as from church, were athletic and played a sport or two. As a result, my school didn't have a hierarchy of popularity like you would see at a public school, meaning by the time we graduated, every last one of us were friends and got along super well with each other. As I progress throughout the rest of the series, y'all will see how our friendship developed. So with that all said, let's talk about my first day of high school. This was a unique day of school since it was exclusively us freshmen. The sophomores and juniors would return the following day, while the seniors wouldn't return until a week and a half later when college courses began. Anyways, Mom took me to school that morning, and before it began, I and the rest of the freshmen went to the multipurpose room. Now, another thing that made my school different from traditional schools were arrival and dismissal times. At traditional schools, school began at 7:45 and ended at 3 o'clock and 3:15 for high schools. Meanwhile, my school started a bit later at 8:30 but ended at 3:45. Well, that is whenever college wasn't in session. Whenever it wasn't, we were dismissed at 2:30 since we didn't have college courses. College didn't start until August 16th, so for the next little while, dismissal would be at 2:30. Anyways, a little while later, our principal went to the front office of the went to the front of the multipurpose room and welcomed us all to early college. He basically just went on about how he was excited about us, the class of 2022, starting here, and kind of went over some more stuff about the school. It's fun to look back on his day since ultimately we would go on to be considered the greatest class of early college history according to most teachers, plus the principal. Well, different principals since we got a new one right before sophomore year, whom I'll talk about more in part 6. Afterwards, we were then taken to the college side of the building that early college was in and taken to the computer lab. For those who have seen part 4, you might recall that during the summer of 2017, I took a week-long website building class. Well, ironically enough, the computer lab that my class was in was this exact computer lab. And this won't be the last time I mention this lab, since I'd have a class for it during freshman, sophomore, and senior years. Anyways, what we did in the computer lab was basically get set up for college courses. So using the computers, we pretty much applied to the community college. Obviously, since all of us were enrolled at the early college, we had a different setup for applying. So it was just us putting our information in and clicking submit. Afterwards, we were all officially students at both the early college and community college. Now, as far as class registration goes, our school registered our classes for us for the first semester of freshman year. We'd get more freedom regarding selecting classes as we progressed throughout early college, especially as we became more knowledgeable about what classes we needed to take. I'll talk more about how I discovered the program evaluation later into the story time, and how I used it to sign up for the right amount of classes in part 6. But for now, our classes were selected for us. I'll talk more about what my classes ended up being once we got to the first day of college classes. After applying, we were then all split into groups of 11, with each group being led by an upperclassman. My group was led by a junior. I don't remember much about her other than the fact that she was really short, so if anyone from the class of 2020 knows who I'm talking about, feel free to tell me. Anyways, we pretty much were taken on a short tour across both the early college and the area surrounding the building. So inside, we basically got to see where the different classrooms were, including a more in-depth tour of the freshman hallway. Additionally, we went to the college side of the building and toured that area. Afterwards, we went outside and toured the outside area surrounding the building, including the gardens that our school worked on its south and the miniature forest to the north of the school. The miniature forest was a very pretty area with a lot of really tall trees, a small creek that ran right through it, and some tables that we refer to as the outdoor classroom. Afterwards, we went back to school and ate lunch. Our school ordered pizza, so we got pizza for lunch that day, which was really nice. After lunch, we were then split into 3 groups, one group for each 9th grade teacher, whom we rotated between the 3. Then afterwards, we were all given Chromebooks. So starting my 8th grade school year, computer usage amongst students became a common in classes. Like every single class I took in 8th grade except algebra, art, PE, involved us using a computer almost every day. So therefore, it was vital for us to have our own computers, so we were issued Chromebooks. Even though these things sucked, being practically useless without Wi-Fi, they did the job and allowed us to do our schoolwork. At the end of the year, we turned them in. I'd of course do that, but interestingly, the one that I was issued in sophomore year would actually stay with me all the way until I graduated. I'll talk about what special circumstance made this so at the end of part 6. Once we were assigned Chromebooks, we were then assigned lockers. Lockers were assigned alphabetically by the last name, and since I came second in that order, my locker was at the very end of the freshman hallway right next to the upperclassman hallway. And then afterwards, we were dismissed. So yeah, pretty nice way to have a first day of high school. Really, the whole first week would have been more introductory stuff, and since the school was trying to get us to get to know each other and our teachers, so this would go on from the following day all the way until that Friday. Then came the next day, being Tuesday, August 7th, which would be kind of like our first real day of school. The day before, we were all received our schedules, so on this day, we applied the schedules and got to attend high school classes for the first time. So let's talk a bit about my schedule. So my first class of the day was English. This was a year-long class where we read books, read short stories, and read plays and did tests. Pretty much your usual English class. But being an early college class, we also incorporated the expeditionary learning curriculum by doing a multitude of projects and doing a lot more physical learning than what you might see at a public school. However, what I remember most from this class was by far the teacher. So alongside my 8th grade teachers, my 9th grade English teacher was one of the most influential and one of the most important teachers I've ever had. She would have a massive impact me on as both a student and a person in general. She would go on and encourage me to do things I'd never been challenged to do by teachers, and ultimately, she would be the one who challenged me to write and publish a book, which I fulfilled when I published A Charm this past March. The link to purchase it will be in the description. However, my relationship with her started out very badly. One thing to note about post-depression period part 1 is that while this was a really good time for me, there was also a time period I was really cocky, which I'm not going to berate myself for since I had all the rights to be cocky during this time, as I literally survived the toughest challenge of my whole life earlier that year. However, the issue was that I didn't really respect authority that much, and as a result, me and my English teacher got into a few fights. And by a few fights, I mean a fight at least once a week, if not more. Mostly from me being lazy and not really wanting to do more. Thankfully, I would change my ways the next semester, and my teacher herself would even apologize for some stuff. And from then on out, we had a great relationship all the way through my time at early college. I'll talk more about how we came to terms when we get to March, and then in April, I'll talk about what my teacher did that made me really like her, as well as what I'd say is why we were so close throughout my time at early college. For now, let's jump over to my next class, being World History. Now, for those who have seen Part 4, this might come as a surprise because, well, I took World History back in 8th grade. In fact, I took 3 high school courses back in 8th grade, being World History, Algebra 1, and Earth Environmental Science. So why am I taking World History again? Well, this ended up being a mistake on our school's part, as they didn't expect us to have already taken World History. While they did account for Algebra 1 and even Earth Environmental Science for 10th grade, since that class is taken in 10th grade at early college, they didn't realize that half of the entire freshman class had already taken World History. So me and the others brought this up to our teacher, and he was able to get it resolved with the school. I'll talk more about what solution we got and what we did instead when we got to Thursday. For now, the next thing we did was lunch. So how lunch worked was that it was supposedly lasted 30 minutes. On Mondays and Wednesdays, we would report to crew afterwards. I'll talk more about what crew was in a little bit, as it wouldn't be again until August 20th. And then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we had Smart Lunch, which is where we could have a 30-minute study hall if we wanted to. I never really went to Smart Lunch except for a couple of times, so I pretty much had an hour at lunch on Tuesdays and Thursdays, as well as the first 2 weeks of school. I typically brought my DS with me, so I mostly spent this time playing Pokemon, although I would do a little more once I began making friends. Also for Fridays, these were 30-minute lunches since we had college classes in the morning on Fridays, which I'll talk more about once college begins. Anyways, after lunch, the hour lunch was up, it was time for my third class, being Geometry. So, unlike World History, our school expected some of us to have already taken Algebra 1 back in 8th grade. So those of us who did took Geometry that fall and then Algebra 2 that spring, with the same teacher taught Algebra 1. Anyways, our teacher was a really cool and very funny guy. This was actually his second to last year teaching, as he would retire after the following year. He would still substitute part-time, so I'll actually talk about him again in Part 8. But for now, he was just our geometry teacher, and I've got to say, he made the class very interesting and fun. While we didn't beat any extreme demons like you would in Geometry Dash, he did at one point use algebraic techniques to prove why the quadratic formula works, and also used a lot of other cool stuff to prove why the math works. Additionally, he would give us a 5-minute break about 30 minutes in, allowing us to refresh our mind before doing some more math. So he was a really cool teacher, and I hope he's enjoying retirement alongside substituting part-time. After geometry came my last high school class of the day, Seminar. So Seminar is a class that's honestly a little difficult to give a set definition for, just like the expeditionary learning curriculum. But you can kind of think of Seminar as somewhat of a study hall, since we mostly spent the time doing homework and stuff. By the way, homework was never that much at all at early college. Like, I almost never had any homework, as part of the expeditionary learning curriculum's doctrine is that learning should be fun, not aggravating. So the only time we ever really had any homework was simply assignments for our college classes or stuff that was assigned for Seminar. Now, Seminar, although mostly a study hall, did at least have somewhat of a set structure regarding when we did what schoolwork. Mondays were our English days, so on Mondays we did work for English. Tuesdays were our World History days, or in my case, study hall. Wednesdays were for intensives, so we did assign intensive work. We spent our time during Seminar on these. But if we were finished with our other work early or any other day, we could spend the remainder of Seminar and work on intensives, if we had intensives. Now, when we weren't working on intensives, Wednesdays were just simply study halls. Thursdays were math days, and Fridays were college days. As for my Seminar teacher, that would have been my geometry teacher. In fact, I didn't even have to move out of my seat since I sat at the same place for both geometry and Seminar, so honestly, I could consider this class to be part of geometry since I never went anywhere. Then afterwards, it was time to leave, and with that, my first real day of high school was finished. Now the next day, being Wednesday, August 8th, things were a little different. So on this day, we began day 1 of 3 of our first intensive. So as mentioned at the beginning of the story time, intensives were basically ways our school utilized expeditionary learning. Each grade level's intensives were designed to help us answer a question assigned to each grade level. For freshmen, that question is, who am I? Therefore, our intensives this year revolved around answering that question of who am I and allowing us to basically discover ourselves. We did 3 intensives as well as a kind of intensive that I'll explain when we get to March. Now, our first intensive was a little different, as it wasn't really designed to answer this question, but it was more for us to get to know each other and for us to build friendships. I'm glad they designed this first intensive like this, since it would ultimately be how I made my friends and would be what brought me and the other freshmen together. This also seems to be the case with everyone else, as throughout my time at early college, I noticed that the freshmen were usually very shy and quiet the first week, but after they finished the first intensive, they were usually energetic and social. So it's safe to say that my school did a great job with this intensive and getting us to get to know each other. Now, for day 1, we visited a local private college not too far from where our school was. We took a tour and also got to eat at the dining hall, which as someone who now goes to a state college over 8 times larger than that college, this dining hall was tiny as hell. But honestly, I don't remember too much from this tour other than the fact that I did not wear my school issued t-shirt. So our school provided everyone with t-shirts with the school logo. However, I forgot to wear mine, and as a result, I didn't blend in with everyone. Thankfully, I wasn't the only one, as some others forgot theirs too, but it was kinda silly. We then got back to school roughly an hour before it was time to leave, so we spent the rest of our time in first block, so in my case, English. Well, not in the classroom, as during this time, we decided to take a walk around campus and pick up trash around the area, so that's what we did. We went outside and walked around and picked up trash. But the reason I remember this is because at one point, I noticed a golf ball just laying there. That's when I decided I was going to keep it because why not? It's a free golf ball. But that's when one girl came up and said, "What if someone stuck that thing up their ass?" Immediately, me, her, and everyone else started laughing since it was such a ridiculous statement. I still kept that ball when I still have that ball today. I did clean it very well and when I got home that day, so hopefully if someone actually did stick it up their ass, I at least didn't get any germs from it. Then the next day, being Thursday, August 9th, we did day 2 of the intensive. It was the least busy of the 3-day intensives, but it was still fun nonetheless. Anyways, the first half of the day went normally, just that we did our first 3 classes that morning and they were short. Additionally, they also got me and the others who had already taken World History taken care of. They decided that while the others took World History, we would take an additional online college course during this time. We would be supervised by the American History teacher during the time, so we just went to his classroom, where he would always start by saying, "The expectations are that you are working the entire time." He and some other teachers had their catchphrases that me and everyone else practically memorized by junior year. And I'll talk about what me and the student government president did at the end of part 7. Now, my relationship with the American History teacher started horribly, but it got better, similar to my relationship with my English teacher, just that it was resolved much quicker, and by quicker, I mean that October. Anyways, our conflict started because I pretty much refused to work on schoolwork during that class. The college class we took during this time would not begin until after Labor Day, since online college courses started even later than in-person courses. But the thing that was getting my stuff done very quickly, and as a result, didn't really have a whole lot of schoolwork to do, so I spent most of my time in his class slacking off. Of course, as his catchphrase went, he expected us to be working the entire time. So when he saw that I was on cool math games rather than doing schoolwork, he immediately took a dislike to me. But in October, I proved that I actually got my work done and was doing very well, and that would be when our relationship took a complete 180. Anyways, moving on to the second half of the day, the intensive portion of that day. So we were split into groups of 5. I was in a group with 3 girls and another guy. Our task was given some paper, tape, and string. We needed to create something to allow an egg to safely fall from a height. So that's what we did. We created a soft platform so that the egg could safely fall down. However, when it came time to actually do the egg dropping, we realized that we overlooked a huge rule. The item had to fall alongside the egg. That's why the other groups went for a parachute design, as the item had to fall with the egg. Therefore, when we dropped the egg, we had to drop our creation with it, and as you can expect, the egg broke upon making contact with the ground, so that ended up being a failure, but it did allow us to get to know one another and build friendships via teamwork. So with that, let's move on to the third and final day of the intensive, being Friday, August 10th. This was by far the most memorable and the best part of the whole intensive. In fact, this day would be so good that it even has a place amongst the best days of my life, placing it itself in the amazing tier. While not nearly as good as days like April 14th, June 23rd, or other supernatural days, August 10th was still a fantastic day that would be when I began developing friendships, and when me and the rest of those in my grade became comfortable with one another. It would pretty much be the day that kinda set the stage for my social life at early college, and be when my early college experience truly began. and it would even be the third best day of post-depression period part 1, and probably my biggest highlight from my freshman year of high school. So, for our last day of intensives, we went to a city called Lenore. Lenore is a mountain city about an hour northwest of where school was. If you saw part 4, you might recognize the city as the place I did my last long course swim meet. This was the same city, just that we weren't going to the pool to swim with me, since swimming didn't start back up until September. Instead, we visited a park somewhere in the city, although I've since forgotten where exactly in Lenore. But what I do remember is that this park had rock climbing, so that's what we did. Anyways, that morning, we spent like 15 minutes at first block, and then we boarded the buses. Boys on one bus and the girls on the other. We also had assigned seats, which while usually were a pain in the ass like they were back in 8th grade, this trip was an exception, since none of us knew each other and nobody had really made any friends yet. So they got us assigned and we sat down. Now, initially, I didn't talk to the dude sitting beside me. Instead, I whipped out my phone and played some Clash Royale. I played a couple 2v2 battles until eventually, the kid beside me began talking. He asked me about the game I was playing, and I explained it to him. The conversation then became non-Clash Royale related, as we began introducing ourselves and talking about our backstory. I learned that this kid's name was Michael. He had previously played football at his middle school, and his dad was also a preacher. I also learned that he attended a church trip similar to Fuge, so I got to learn more about his experience while I told him about my experience at Fuge. Although I didn't mention getting left out or anything that made Fuge really suck. It also helped that it seemed like everyone else was getting along as well. So by the time we arrived, everyone was pretty chatty and I'd already made at least one friend. Then once we got to the park, we were split into two groups, Group A and Group B. Group A started with rock climbing and then moved on to team building exercises. Meanwhile, Group B started with team building exercises and then went on to rock climbing. I was in Group A while Michael was in Group B, so we were separated during our time at the park, meaning I was back at being by myself. Thankfully, I'd make another friend pretty quickly while waiting for a rock climbing wall to be available. So I don't know if I was looking at a history meme or what, but another kid took interest and talked to me. Eventually, I learned that his name was Lucas. He had actually came from the same middle school that I did, just that we were on different teams, so we never interacted. But me and Lucas had quite a bit in common, and he'd also be the butt of many jokes throughout our time at early college, and I'll talk more about what I mean by that throughout the rest of the series. Eventually, a wall was available, and I was next in line to climb, so I got myself prepared to climb it. However, what I didn't know was that the three walls were actually all different levels of difficulty. One was for beginners, one was for intermediate climbers, and one was for experts. And of course, knowing my luck, I ended up going to the one for experts. So when I was trying to climb it, I struggled. And by struggle, I mean I was struggling to even get 3 feet in the air. My English teacher then saw that I was struggling, so she called over the tallest guy in her grade to help me out. This kid was almost 6 feet tall, and while he was a giant, he was a really nice guy and very helpful guy. So he came over and helped me reach a couple of feet before eventually he couldn't reach me. But nonetheless, thanks to his help, I was able to get much farther up than I would have without his help. It would be about a month before we both started really talking, but when we did, I learned that his name was Dylan. Dylan really liked working on the cars, and I'll talk about what he did to Lucas's car in part 8. He also was a very smart guy, and he'd ultimately be our class's valedictorian, and he was also an Eagle Scout, which he had been promoted to that summer before starting at early college, so he was a very well-rounded and really awesome dude. So that's friend number 3 that I made that day. I don't make friends, new friends very often, as I emphasized a lot in part 1 when I discussed how I didn't make my first friend until I was 9 years old. Of course, much of that is due to me being autistic, but I'm also one of those who simply doesn't make friends that often. So for me to make 3 friends in one day is crazy. And the best part is that I had made one friend on this day too. I had made one more friend too that I'll get to later. So after that, the rest of those in Group A did their rock climbing, and then we switched over to the team building exercises. I don't remember any of these exercises outside of one, so I'll talk about that one. Anyways, for this activity, we were all standing up on a tarp. Our goal was to flip the tarp over while still standing on it. So the way that we took on this challenge was that a girl pretty much decided to step in and be the leader, to which me and everyone else unanimously gave her the go for it, and we listened to her. Her idea was that 2 people would pull the tarp on its left corner, while the rest of us would jump on it. We would continue jumping until the tarp was flipped on its side. So that's what we did. I believe Dylan and someone else volunteered to pull the tarp, while our leader counted on intervals of 3, where the 2 tarp pullers would pull the tarp by 3 feet on each interval. This ended up being a perfect strategy, as we were able to complete this challenge very quickly with a lot of ease. So yeah, props to the team for doing this challenge so well, and props to the leader for formulating a really good plan. I go on to be really good friends with her and the 2 other girls I often refer to as the girls, whom I'll talk more about in part 8. After we did the team building exercises, we then boarded the bus again and stopped at Golden Corral to eat lunch. This time though, the buses were a lot louder and there were a lot more talking, as it seems like everyone else had also made some new friends. In fact, I actually reached out to a few others when writing Storytime 30, and a lot of them said that this was how they met their friends, so it was clear that this trip did a lot. Anyways, I don't remember what I ate at Golden Corral. However, I do remember the ride back from Golden Corral, as everyone was just out of it. Like, everyone was so tired, and eventually, me, Michael, and the teachers were the only ones awake on the bus. I can't blame them though, as we did a lot, especially in very hot weather. In fact, me and Michael were tired too, but the only reason we didn't go to sleep was because Michael stole 2 gummy bears, decapitated them, and swapped their heads, so we were messing around and laughing about those. Eventually, we arrived back at school, where it was just about time to go home, so we all went to our lockers and got our stuff to head out. But as I was getting my stuff out of mine, the girl whose lockers was above me started talking to me. She was really nice and introduced herself. Her name was Gabby. She was Puerto Rican, so she had a really cool accent and was also a really fun person to be around. As you'll come to find that many Puerto Ricans and other people from the Caribbean are really fun people to talk to. Anyways, I don't really remember what all was discussed, but I remember telling her telling me a joke, to which I laughed too. And then she told a friend of hers walking across the hallway the same joke in Spanish, also making her laugh. I then talked with her on our way outside until I saw Mom's van, to which I waved her goodbye and then enjoyed my weekend. So yeah, that was my first full week of early college. It was definitely a massive change of pace, and so much more different than the previous first weeks of school, given that I was now at a new type of school that approached learning in a completely different way compared to traditional public schools. And also the other students I was around were a lot more like me, as these students all wanted to go here and cared about school, given that they all had to apply to go here. Therefore, none of the nonsense that takes place in a public school happened here, which was so comforting to me, especially knowing that I wasn't going to be around anyone like the boys from 8th grade or my church. I was also the only one at my school who went to my church, so that also made things a lot easier since I never had to see anyone from church, especially after all the shit that they put me through at Fuge. Speaking of which, during this time, I was actually trying to make up my friendships with those in my grade. Even though what they did at Fuge was awful and still affects me today, I still wanted to at least try to stay friends with them and hope that a relationship could go back to like how it was back when I was in 8th grade. I do this through a variety of different ways throughout the school year. Spoiler alert, none of them worked, and I talk about giving up on them in part 6. So going back to school, since nothing much happened from Monday to Wednesday of that next week, let's skip over a little bit to Thursday, August 16th. So this is a special day because it marked the first day of college courses, meaning that from then on, we were dismissed at 3:45 since we stayed an extra hour and 15 minutes for college courses. Now, unlike our high school courses, where some were full year courses while others were semester-long courses, college courses were exclusively either semester-long courses, 16 weeks, half semester-long courses, 8 weeks, or quarter semester-long courses, 4 weeks. Every college class I took in freshman year was a 16-week course, so don't worry about figuring out which one is not a course that was a full semester or not. I'll talk more about taking 8-week courses in part 6, and I'll talk about taking a 4-week course in part 7. Now, how college courses work for the semester was that Monday through Thursday, we rotated between 2 college courses from 2:30 to 3:45. Half the grade would take one class while the other went into another. Then on Friday mornings, we rotated between one of those classes from Mondays and Wednesdays, which I'll reveal in a bit, and a 1-credit class that only met on Fridays. Once again, I know this might all sound really confusing, but I'll explain each course individually and also talk about their meeting times to not cause too much confusion. Additionally, because these classes were taught by professors at the community college, a good majority of these courses did not apply to the expeditionary and line curriculum, as these were of course college courses. Although a few did, for the most part, these classes were basically community college classes like where you'd see anywhere else. So, first college class I ever attended, as well as my Tuesday and Thursday course, was Physical Education 11. I don't even know how 111. It's like 111. I don't even know how I can say that. Like how I can't even roll that off the tongue. We'll say 111. Okay, 111. Which is Physical Fitness 1, or PE as I'll simply refer to it as throughout the story time. Those who saw part 4 know just how much hell PE was back in middle school, albeit it wasn't that bad in 7th grade as compared to 8th grade, but it was still a complete nightmare back in middle school. I thankfully was able to get out of PE for the last quarter of 8th grade after I broke my arms, but considering I became fully healed back in July, I was no longer able to use my arms as an excuse to get out of PE. But thankfully, the PE class I took as a freshman was a billion times better than PE was back in middle school. Our PE professor was actually a really cool guy. He didn't have any biases towards the athletic kids, since there weren't any sports at our school, although he did show some bias towards the well-behaved students like teachers should, and since I was a well-behaved student, he took a liking into me. Like, even in 10th grade on up, whenever we saw each other in the hallway, he remembered my name and always said hello, so my professor was really cool. Wish he could have been my PE teacher back in middle school. Would have made PE so much better. Now, for what we did, well, we never really did all that much in this class. Most of the time, we used this class as a study hall, as sometimes our professor didn't feel like taking us outside or there was inclement weather that made going outside unsafe. This was especially prevalent in September when Hurricane Florence made landfall, and in October when Hurricane Michael hit us. I'll talk more about these storms when we get there. Now, when we did go outside to do actual PE, we simply walked up to the college's track. It was an old track that also had a baseball field in the center of it. In order to maintain an A in the class, all we had to do was do something during this time. Me and Michael spent this time walking around and talking, which gave us both an A for this class. So yeah, this is a really easy A. And the best part is that it provided both college and high school credit, since high schoolers all have to take a semester of PE. So we were knocking out that credit out, and as a result, we never had to do PE again after the semester. Now, when it was too cold or when it was raining, we'd of course hang out in the classroom and chill. Technically, it was supposed to work like a study hall, but our professor didn't care what we did, just as long as we weren't making too much noise. Me and Michael near the beginning of the semester decided to spend this time learning how to pronounce the word lumino-ultramicroscopic silicovolcanoconiosis, the longest word in the English dictionary. It's surprisingly not a tough word to say, since it includes root words that you've probably seen before, or stems as I brought up in parts 2, 3, and 4. I'll talk more about this word in part 6, since I used this word for a presentation for a course that I took back at sophomore year. So, that was one class. Let's jump to the next day, being Friday, August 17th. So as mentioned, college courses took place in the mornings on Fridays, and in the afternoon, we would have our high school classes but condensed. So on Fridays, I had 2 classes. My first class was Computer Science 110, which is Introduction to Computers, or Computers as I'll refer to it as. Pretty much this class is, as the title says, an introduction to computers. We talked about how a computer works, a textbook definition of computers, Microsoft 360, and all the other stuff that me and everyone else pretty much knew already since we grew up with technology. This was that weird class I mentioned earlier that met 3 times a week, but at a different time on Fridays. It met on Mondays and Wednesdays from 2:30 to 3:45, but it met on Fridays at 9 o'clock. Weird timing, I know, but this class exclusively consisted of early college students. By the way, we could sometimes be in classes with adult students, which I saw quite a bit in my online classes, but I did sometimes have classes with adult students in person, and I'll explain those classes in the second halves of part 6 and 7. Anyways, the professor for this course was pretty bad. She definitely would have been a better professor at a university, since she taught this class as if we were university students, despite knowing that we were all 14, 15 years old and only freshmen in high school. Like, despite this being one of our first college courses, she expected that we know how college goes and expected us to pretty much provide work as if we were already fully adapted to college. As a result, this class became quite difficult, and I still considered it one of the toughest college classes I've ever taken. Okay, well, maybe not as hard as intermediate accounting or econometrics, but in comparison to most other classes I've taken at both early college and university, this is a pretty tough class. Now, another issue with my professor was that she had a habit of hiding our assignments from us and not mentioning them in class. This was especially the case for the first week. So the following Friday, we had 5 assignments due, including a quiz, 3 assignments, and an exam for Chapter 1. I and most others did the quiz and the exam. However, those 3 assignments were in a completely different location than the other Chapter 1 stuff. They were located in a folder at the very bottom of the module page. As a result, very few students did these, and the class average's grade at the end of the first week was only at 33. In fact, I had a 26 at the end of the first week. And the worst part is that our professor refused to provide makeup work or curve the class average since she expected us to do these assignments, even if only 2 people in the entire class did them. Yeah, she was pretty much setting us all up for failure. And just to make things worse, she never even taught the class. Like on the first day, she went over the syllabus and stuff, but then every day afterwards, she just let us do her work while she sat at her desk. And of course, she never announced due dates and stuff. So I don't know how she expected us to do those 3 assignments when she was literally hiding them from everyone. But at least I wouldn't miss a single one for the rest of the semester. Now, going back to a more lighthearted topic, I do want to mention the significance of this classroom. So this was the class that I was referring to when I brought up the computer lab. We went to apply to the community college, as well as where I did that website building class back in part 4. So our class met in the computer lab, and as a result, we got to use the computers over our school-issued laptops, which felt really nice since the laptops at our school had restrictions and bans, meaning we could goof off and do whatever on the desktops. and that's what I did on Wednesdays and Fridays. On Mondays, I would get my assignments, quizzes, and exams done. The exams weren't as much on exams as they were assignments. And then, I would goof off on Wednesdays and Fridays, mostly switching to my personal Google account and creating Pokemon teams, since that was of course my big interest at the time. By the way, I quickly became known throughout the grade as that kid who was really into Pokemon, and even kept that persona all the way until I graduated, even if my interest in it wasn't as high by the time I graduated as it was when I was a freshman. So that was computers. After computers on Fridays at 10:15, we would then rotate with the other class and switch to academic support 115, which was success and study skills, or academic support as I'll simply call it in the story time since that's how me and the rest of the school refer to it as. So this was a very appropriate class for us to take our first semester, as it was a class designed to help us form study tips and prepare for taking college courses, as college courses are a lot different than high school courses. This class went into detail about time management strategies, note-taking strategies, test-taking strategies, you name it. Honestly, much of this course was forgettable, and I never really took much of the advice my professor gave, since you'll come to know that community college classes were, for the most part, really easy. And by really easy, I'd say they were generally easier than my high school classes. Of course, computers was an exception, but there'd be a few more exceptions later on. But for the most part, my community college classes were really easy, and sometimes an A could be achievable by simply submitting a blank document. I talk about that happening in part 6 and 8, since, believe it or not, it happened with not one, but two, but 3 professors. As for the professor himself, he was a chill dude. He actually was the pianist and organist in my church, so he was a familiar face. He even once became a big meme in the church for playing 3 keyboards at once, which I gotta say, that's very impressive. But other than that, there isn't much to mention about him, especially given that this was a 1-credit class and met once a week. So those are my in-person college classes. I did have one more that I was taking as well, but that being a college class that I took in place of world history, aka the college class I was supposed to be working on during second block. However, it was an online class, and online classes did not start until after Labor Day, so I'll talk about it then. And then after academic support, we headed back to the early college side of the building and ate lunch, which actually is really funny to mention because you'll come to know that my school was rather hypocritical regarding a rule with walking on the college in age. So the college's rules was that you had to be at least 16 years old to walk on campus by yourself. So of course this meant that us freshmen had to be accompanied by our teachers when walking to class. However, we didn't have to be accompanied when walking from class back to class to the early college side, but we had to walk with our teacher to get to the college side. This rule did not make any sense, but when we get to part 6, we're going to see this rule be even more hypocritical. I believe they got rid of this rule the year after I graduated since it did far more harm than good, but it was still a really ridiculous rule. Anyways, lunch would last until 12 o'clock, where we would then have our high school classes in a condensed setting. Now, what also made Fridays special were that at the end of every Friday, we would do a thing called Closing Circle. Before it, we would do clubs, although they wouldn't begin until the following Friday, which is when I'll discuss mine. But anyways, during Closing Circle, the entire school would form a large circle around the multi-purpose room. Well, not quite a large circle, as our circles always look like ovals, but fuck it, we'll call it a circle. Anyways, the teachers would be in the middle of the circle, where they would make announcements. So whether it was our principal announcing days off or early release days, or the American history teacher announcing the next blood drive, this was their time to make announcements. After the teachers made their announcements, they would offer the circle for students who wished to make announcements. So let's say a student was sponsoring a fundraiser. They would use this time to announce to the school what they were raising. Now, these had to be actual announcements, so you couldn't say something stupid like, I fucked a chick while doing my math homework or something dumb like that. Speaking of making babies, once all the students' announcements were finished, a teacher would take the microphone and announce birthdays for the week. I thankfully never received a shout out for my birthday since my birthday's in June, which is when school was out, so I never had to worry about unneeded attention like what I experienced back at Fuge. And even then, our school never sang happy birthday, so it wasn't like it was that bad for those who did not have their luxury of having a summer birthday. Then came the last part of Closing Circle, the Spirit Read. So this read usually was read by a teacher, although sometimes a student would read a short 1 to 2 sentence passage, and then we would be dismissed. So yeah, that's how Fridays worked at my school. There were also clubs, but those wouldn't start until the next Friday, August 24th. I'll talk about those when we get there. So let's move on to the following week. So that Monday, our school started crew on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. On Mondays and Wednesdays, crew took place from 11:30 to 12, so between lunch and geometry. And on Fridays, it was our first class of the day, being 8:30 to 9, so right before college classes. Now, you're probably sitting there wondering, the fuck is crew? Well, the name crew is based on our school's motto, we are crew, not passengers. This motto basically exemplifies that participation part of expeditionary learning. So even though it seems glaring, we did participate in stuff in crew. As for crew itself, providing a clear definition for it is just as challenging as giving a definition for expeditionary learning. In fact, my music cut off again. In fact, after I wrote and recorded Storytime 11, there was a big meme that went around our school about how you entered early college without knowing what crew was, and how you exited early college without knowing what crew was. So we always said crew is crew. Now, I know I might have y'all lost, but I explained what we did in crew throughout the Storytime, as well as Storytimes in part 6 and 7. So at least by then y'all start to understand it a little better. Now, how crew worked was that each student as a freshman is assigned a teacher's crew. This teacher could be any teacher at our school, and the student would have that teacher for crew from freshman to junior year. Seniors do not do crew, which is why I won't discuss crew too much in part 8, although I will bring it up a couple times. I should also mention that each crew consists of freshmen, sophomores, and juniors, so crew also allowed us freshmen to meet some upperclassmen. As for my crew leader, that would be my English teacher. As mentioned, we were pretty much enemies throughout freshman year. Thankfully, we would make up near the end of the year, so I'll talk about that later. But for now, crew really sucked since I had to spend an extra 30 minutes in our class. At least once we stopped fighting, crew would be a lot more enjoyable. But for now, crew was not a fun part of the day. Now, the way we knew what to do in crew was by following a little booklet the school made. This booklet, which everyone received, included a schedule of stuff we did as a crew. It listed out the entire curriculum, the dates we would do each activity, and had a set schedule for crew, so we followed it to see what we were doing each day. However, there was some exceptions to the book being used as a schedule. Those exceptions are what I'll refer to as the Big Five. These 5 projects or activities were the 5 exceptions not included in the book, as they were so significant and big that while the book provided time for them via the dates, the book didn't have a set of instructions or manuals for them. In chronological order, they were the Crew Flag, the Rube Goldberg Machine, the Amazing Crew Race, the Crew Shield, and Earth Day. The first one I will mention is the Crew Flag, which I'll touch on once we get to September. Alright, so moving on to Wednesday, August 22nd. So I bring up this day because something really stupid happened that I often laugh about today. So you'll come to know that the multi-purpose room was usually very loud and crowded during lunchtime, since everyone ate lunch at the same time. So therefore, me, Michael, and a few others would eat outside in the hallway to have some peace. We pretty much let anyone hang out with us, and by the time we stopped eating lunch in the hallway in 10th grade when COVID-19 hit, 3/4 of the entire grade ate in the hallway with us. In fact, sometimes our teachers even joined us and hung out with us. So everyone was having a blast. By the way, we wouldn't eat in the hallway in junior year because obviously COVID screwed everything up. But we would do something similar to our hallway gatherings in senior year, that I'll touch on in part 8. Anyways, I bring this up because during this time, me and some others would play Clash of Clans on our phones, look at memes, and take random pictures of each other. You know, typical high school stuff. However, as I was taking my trash to the multipurpose room to throw away my stuff, I guess I didn't keep my phone in my pocket, as I ended up throwing my trash away. But when I got back to my hallway, I noticed I didn't have my phone. After searching all over the place, I realized that I might have thrown my phone away. I then asked the lunch lady to look through the trash can to see if my phone was in there, and as much as we looked through it, we couldn't find it, so therefore, I was without a phone. I'd at least get a new phone for Christmas that year, so I wouldn't be without one forever, but not having a phone was really inconvenient. So let's jump a little bit to Friday, August 24th. This was the first quote-unquote normal Friday of the school year, which is where we did our college courses that morning, did our high school classes that afternoon, and then participated in clubs. So in clubs, which lasted from 2:30 to 3:45, were really nice ways of wrapping up the end of the week. During the second week of school, so the previous week, we got to select a club we wanted to participate in, and so we would take part in it. These were also perfect extracurricular activity builders for when it would be time to apply to colleges, which I'll discuss my experience with in part 8. Clubs were required for freshmen, sophomores, and juniors, but they were optional for seniors. I would do clubs as a senior since my school was really close to where I worked, and I always worked on Fridays, as well as just because clubs were always a blast. As for what club I participated in 9th and 12th grades, that would be Quiz Bowl. We could switch clubs each year, as I'd actually do a different club sophomore year and no club junior year due to coronavirus. Anyways, Quiz Bowl was a trivia-style game where 2 teams competed against each other by answering trivia questions that could range from a whole multitude of different topics, ranging from different books to movies to math to religion to history to even pop culture. Whoever guessed the most amount of points would be the winner. As for the people in the club, The club was run by the world history teacher, so even though I wasn't in world history, I still got to see him on Fridays. And yes, I did eventually take a class under him, that being civics and economics, which I took in 12th grade. Anyways, he was really cool, and honestly, I kinda wish I did take it for world history under him since he was a really cool guy. As for the other members, I think 3/4 of the entire club were juniors. There were only 3 of us freshmen, a couple of sophomores, and 2 seniors. These 2 seniors would be the powerhouse of the club, as they were the ones answering questions quickly and scoring the most points. In fact, it usually is the seniors who dominated Quiz Bowl, as when I partook in it as a senior, I was the powerhouse of this club since I wasn't the only senior in the club. I'll talk about that in part 8 though, but for now, while the upperclassmen, especially the seniors, dominated, I still held my game and scored a few points, so I was still doing quite well. So yeah, I was starting to get really into the group of things, and I was becoming very well adapted to the new norm. The next Monday, August 27th, school started back up for public schools. This might sound unusual that I'm bringing this up since I didn't go to public school for high school, but I bring it up because this would change the way arrival and dismissal worked for me, since Zoe was in public school. So she just started the 6th grade at the intermediate school I went to back in part 2. Just that her 6th grade was much easier than mine because she transferred to the school back in 5th grade, as well as her just naturally being outgoing, extroverted, and making friends easier to meet. Now I bring this up because starting her first day of school, our grandmother would begin taking me and her to school. So her grandmother would come by our house and pick us up, and then she would take Zoe to her school since she started at 7:45. Afterwards, she would take me over to the high school I would have gone to had I not gone to early college. Here a bus would be waiting to take early college students to the early college. We would only do this until October when my grandmother decided to just take me to school herself since she participated in a club near my school. And in a month before 10th grade started, I would get my driver's permit, so I'd begin driving her car to Zoe's school and in my school to get ours. Now, for dismissal, how that worked was that after my last college class, or closing circle on Fridays, a bus would take me from my school back to the high school. Here, Mom would pick me up, and this was easy since all the students who went to this high school had already been picked up. Mom usually was a little late since she was a school teacher and therefore had to hang out at school a little bit after dismissal, but it wasn't ever that long of a wait. It also helped that my Chromebook could connect to the internet at this school, so I could hop on it and do random stuff while waiting for Mom. Now when swimming started back up, I'd simply walk straight to the pool building since this was the school we practiced at on Mondays and Wednesdays. Mom would always have Zoe leave my bag there, so I would get changed and then go to practice. However, swimming didn't start back up until mid-September, so for now, I was just waiting on Mom. So as for afterwards, Mom would take me and Zoe to the gym she cheered for, so Mom also taught gymnastics part-time. I mentioned how in part 1, Mom owned and operated a competitive cheerleading business. Well, even though she closed her business, she still taught gymnastics on the side, so she was a coach for her sister-in-law, my aunt. She also coached the cheerleading team at the middle school alongside my aunt, which is why before I attempted suicide, I was only really known for being the cheer coach's nephew and assistant coach's son back in middle school. Thankfully, I was away from all that bullshit from 8th grade, but even as an adult, I'm still traumatized from everything that happened back in middle school. But anyways, last thing I want to mention before I finally move on to September, I want to talk a little bit about church. So the day before the first day of school was for everyone else, 3 weeks into the school. For me, we had Promotion Sunday, where incoming first graders began attending the worship service, or Big Church as they often call it, as well as incoming 7th graders were officially part of the youth group and where everyone else moved up a grade. So technically, I was still considered an 8th grader by my church even though I had already begun high school 3 weeks earlier. It wasn't much of an issue though, as they split the high schoolers and middle schoolers up for Sunday school during that time, so I would hang out with the high schoolers in order to get some time away from that same dipshits that let me out that fuge. I hung out with Preston's sister during these by the way, since we became closer and closer throughout the year. But on Promotion Sunday, we were now officially recognized as 9th graders by our church, so starting from then until the end of the school year, we would attend a Sunday school specifically for 9th graders, and we would participate in a Sunday school for our respective grade until we graduated. At the time, this provided a great opportunity for me to try to talk to those in my grade and resolve our friendships. However, as mentioned, these would become great failures, and as a result, I would give up during the summer of 2019, leave the Baptist denomination, and almost lose my faith entirely as well. Thankfully, I regained my faith and now consider myself a Methodist, but church would be a very difficult time from then all the way until I regained my faith a little over a month ago. So with that about wraps up August. August 2019 was a pretty crazy month with a lot happening, so let's move on to September. September 2018, while not anywhere near as eventful as August, was still quite eventful in its own right, so let's get to it. How about we start by talking about my last college class to start. So this was an online college course that took in place in world history. Technically, second block was the time allocated for me to work on it, but knowing me, I almost never utilized this time to work on it, and that of course didn't make our American history teacher very happy, who's our supervisor during this time. Well, actually, I did spend time working on this class during this time, but the coursework wasn't ever that much, and I would finish it very quickly, leaving me with the whole week to do nothing. As for the course itself, that would be Health 120, Community Health. This course was pretty much an introduction to public health. Now, at the time, this material from this course wasn't really mainstream. Well, I mean, some stuff was, but at the time, public health wasn't really as mainstream as it is today, since I took this course a year and a half before the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure this class is completely different today and as a result of the pandemic, but because I took it pre-COVID, this class honestly wasn't really all that memorable and didn't necessarily apply to the news at the time. So with that, let's talk about high school courses and all I did in them. To start, let's talk about English. So near the beginning of the month, we began reading To Kill a Mockingbird, a required reading for 9th grade. For those who haven't read one of the most well-known pieces of literature, basically this book follows the story of a 5-year-old girl in 1930s rural Alabama. It goes into pretty deep detail about the mistreatment of black people at the time, and you hear quite a bit about her father, who is a lawyer who often defends black Americans against the racially unjust system that plagued Alabama and the rest of the South before the Civil Rights Movement. So that's what we began reading. Eventually, once we finished the book, our teacher assigned us a project to do as a class. Now, I'm sorry if I accidentally spoil the book, but I'll try my best not to, since To Kill a Mockingbird is actually a really good read. Anyways, for this project, we had to basically enact a court scene from the book. We were all randomly selected for different roles from the book. However, let's just say that I had an interesting role. So, I was the witness for the prosecution. Now, this case involved a woman falsely accusing a black man of rape for the sole reason of putting a black man in prison. And as you can expect, being 1930s rural Alabama, the court system was very heavily biased against blacks and other non-white races. In fact, in the book, the man whose role I played even said a racial slur a few times when he was taking a stand. Originally, this scared me a little bit, so I was worried I was going to have to say that word, but thankfully, our teacher provided us with a scene in play format, and that word was changed to a much more school-appropriate and less offensive word, so I didn't have to worry about saying it. And even if it wasn't marked out, I'd still probably use a different word just because I wouldn't dare say it. As for the play itself, well, it was quite cringy. The reason is because I thought we had to memorize the lines. So when it came time for us to do the play, I thought that I was going to paraphrase some stuff that would work. But turns out, we were allowed to read off our script during the play. So whenever I would be asked questions and say something off the script, this confused and frustrated whoever asked me the question. As a result, this unfortunately would not be my proudest project, but our teacher still gave us all 100, so can't really complain too much. Also, just because Dylan asked me to include this quote back when I was running Storytime 30, I'll include it here. So Dylan played the role of the defendant, and throughout the play, he said she was mistaken in her mind over 20 times. Figured I'd include that there since that would go on to be one of the dumbest things any of us said freshman year. Additionally, our technology guy struggled to record the play, so we had to do it twice. Well, the first time we got halfway until we realized that he didn't press record, so we had to restart from there. But then, when we got about a quarter of the way there, his iPad died, and by then, class was finished. So we decided to not bother with recording the play and didn't even finish the whole thing, which me and everyone else was happy about. As a result, we were the only class to not have video proof of the play, which, now, also in English, we began doing vocabulary words. So these vocabulary words were often seen on the ACT. Even though we wouldn't take the ACT until 11th grade, which I'll talk about my experience taking in part 7, it was still beneficial for us to start preparing by going over some words that we would see on the ACT. So that's what we did from then until February, which is when we got through the whole list. For the most part, these were really easy, since we just had to use Quizlet to memorize words and their definitions. But occasionally, our teacher would throw a curveball at us, and these tests occasionally would be hard. But after a couple of these tests, she would just resort to using quizzes for vocabulary words, which made these tests so much easier since they would provide a definition, and you would be given a word, which is how we learned definitions via Quizlet. So moving on from school, although I'll go back to it in a little bit to discuss crew, let's talk about swimming. So the middle of September was when our long break from swimming came to an end. Additionally, it would be the beginning of short course season. So I explained this more in depth in part 4, but pretty much during the short course season, which is from September to March, we swim in 25-yard pools for me. On the other hand, during the long course, which was from April to July, we swim in 50-meter pools, usually outside. For this story time, I'll only be discussing on one quote-unquote official meet, which I'll discuss in November, a false official meet, which I'll discuss in January, and an unofficial meet that I'll get to in October. The 2 official meets would be in 25-yard pools, while the unofficial meet would be in a 25-meter pool. Anyways, during short course, we used 2 pools for practice. One was a 25-yard pool that was owned by the high school my bus picked me up and took me back to. We practiced in this pool on Mondays and Wednesdays. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, we swam at a pool at another high school that had a 25-meter pool. I refer to these pools as their respective length for the story time. Anyways, on Mondays and Wednesdays, Mom would have Zoe take my swim bags to the pool since she also swam. So all I had to do was walk over to the pool from where the bus dropped me off to begin practice. However, the practice time was often really tough. You see, practice was from 4:30 to 5:45, and my bus often did not arrive at our school until 4:25, or at this school until 4:25. So I had to walk across the school's campus just to get to the 25-yard pool, where I then had to put my swimsuit on and then I could begin practice, making me late to almost every Monday and Wednesday practice. This very much pissed off my coach, who, remember, was an asshole who only cared about swimming and didn't care about any of us. In fact, when Mom told him that I would be late for these practices, given that I was an early college student, he was upset at the fact that I was going to early college instead of focusing on swimming. This would ultimately lead to me becoming demotivated to swim. At first, the demotivation wasn't terrible, but by the end of 2018, it got really bad to the point that I stopped doing swim meets and eventually led to me quitting the team entirely after my coach harassed me for not wanting to do meets and becoming demotivated. I'll discuss more about that when we get to January. Now, as for Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday practices, those would of course be at the 25-meter pool. These practices were later, being from 5:30 to 6:45, so I was able to attend these on time. How transportation worked for these was that Mom picked me up after I dropped by the high school, and then I would wait at the place she coached gymnastics. Then afterwards, she would take me and Zoe to practice. Now, the one saving grace regarding practices was Alex, so I talked about being friends with Alex back in parts 2 and 3. We met through swimming and are still good friends today. However, unknown to me at the time, Alex was also feeling the same way about our coach at the time, and as a result, he too would quit the team in 2019, although a little later than me and Zoe. But me and Zoe would ultimately be the catalyst for what caused many swimmers to quit the team before the coach was ultimately fired in early 2021. Although in Alex's case, he wouldn't quit swimming entirely, as he would begin swimming for his high school when he started 9th grade a year after me, and would go on to be the best swimmer on the team for all 4 years. So, enough about swimming, let's talk about church. So in part 4, I talked about how we initially started going to this church and how I joined the youth during the summer of 2017. I also mentioned how starting on Mondays and Monday nights, I began participating in a thing called small groups. How this worked was that there was 4 small groups: middle school boys, middle school girls, high school guys, and high school girls. Each group would go to a youth leader's home, where they would eat snacks, play games, and do a Bible study. In part 4, I of course participated in the middle school boys group, and it was fun since this was before the same guys fucked me up at Fuge. So this year, I figured that I might as well try to do small groups to grow closer with them and to try to revive our friendships. So I participated in the High School Skies group. Now, unlike the other small groups, this took place at a church, so I went here every Monday. This would also prove to be a failure, so I won't talk about it too much here. Anyways, let's go back to school and discuss crew. So in early September, we were provided the first of the big 5 projects, the crew flag. How this worked was that as a crew, we designed a flag that represented our group and represented some values we have as a crew, similar to how most flags are designed. Now, you'll come to know that I didn't contribute much on this project, nor did I contribute much to really anything we did in crew this year. The reason is because that's actually how the hierarchy at crew works. Freshmen tend not do as much in crew as sophomores, and sophomores don't do as much as juniors. This is because juniors have been through this stuff for 2 years, so they tend to know what to do, unlike freshmen who don't. Therefore, you're going to see me often not do as much in crew in the story time, but you'll see me do a little more in part 6. As for part 7, we didn't do crew for most of the year due to COVID-19, but when we did do crew, you'll see me be the superstar of the group. Afterwards, getting back to the project, it was actually an interesting outcome. You see, ever since Storytime 2, I've always described it as being rocket ships surrounding the moon. However, after coming across the script that we used for presenting the flag, it was actually it's on a dartboard. They looked very similar to rocket ships though, since we even put a galaxy scenery over the poster to represent the infinite possibilities our crew could accomplish, so it makes sense why I'm mistaking these for rocket ships. Now, inside the dartboard, we put the phrase, find your true north. This is a phrase our teacher had used for every crew flag since she began teaching at the early college. To find your true north means to find your authentic self, or find your true calling. This ties into expeditionary learning, which encourages learners to find their true meaning and their calling, so we included that on the board. Now, in addition to creating the flags, we also had to present them in front of the school. So each crew selected a few students from their group to go to the center of closest circle sometime in late September to present their flags. I ended up being amongst this group from our crew to present. I was in charge of explaining what the dartboard meant, so I talked about how it represents why mistakes are important and how just like not hitting the board the first try, you won't get everything down on the first try. I simply read off a script, so I didn't have to memorize anything, so this wasn't too hard to present. Now, last thing before I move on to October, let's talk about a hurricane. So midway through September, Hurricane Florence made landfall into North and South Carolinas. While this didn't cause much flooding, since Charlotte is like 3 hours from the beach, it still caused heavy rain and intensive rainfall and storms and also caused a lot of tornado watches. As a result, we ended up getting 2 days out of school due to inclement weather. Thankfully, nothing too intense happened, so I spent my days off playing Pokemon. Same thing would happen in October when Hurricane Michael hit us. And with that, that's all that happened in September. Let's move on to October. October 2018 was a pretty decent month, so let's get to it. To start, let's discuss swimming. So our coach managed to convince the high school we swam the 25-meter pool in to let us participate in one of their upcoming events, or upcoming meets. So this meet was at high school versus another high school versus our swim club. There were, however, 2 rules we had to follow. 1, only high school age swimmers could participate, and 2, our victories would not go against the high schools. So our victories didn't count since at the end of the day, we were doing this for fun. And even though I was becoming more and more demotivated to swim, I did at least get in a swim at a high school swim meet, since I didn't get to do that because early college didn't have sports. Now, unfortunately, I have no records at this meet, so while I do remember what events I swam, I do not remember my times. But what I do remember is that we as a club kicked both of these schools' asses. Much of this can be explained by the fact that we were year-round swimmers and more experienced, as opposed to high school swimmers who only swim in the fall. In fact, in every one of my events, I was always in the last heat and I managed to beat everyone on the other teams. In fact, I even won an event, the first and only time I've ever been able to do so in a meet. Anyways, the events I was swimming were the 100 IM, 100 freestyle, 100 breaststroke, and 100 butterfly. Damn it, coach put me in the 100 butterfly again, but at least this would actually be a pretty good event. So for the 100 IM, 100 freestyle, and 100 breaststroke, I beat everyone from the other schools, even the seniors, but I did lose to those on my own team. However, on the 100 butterfly, this would be the only 100 butterfly I'd ever done that I actually enjoyed. You see, I was the only one on our team to participate in this event, so I was a little scared. Additionally, everyone I was going up against appeared to be either a junior or a senior, so I was much younger than everyone else. But the actual event was so fun and hilarious. You see, despite this being one of my least favorite and worst events, I managed to kick everyone's ass on this event. I managed to win first place in this event, and I was an entire 15 seconds faster than second place. All this despite me being the slowest one on our team. Yeah, I managed to kick everyone's ass in the 100 butterfly, and I was only a freshman. Needless to say, I had a pretty good meet. Sucks I don't remember a whole lot from it, but it was really fun. Now, going back to school, let's discuss the second intensive we did this school year. This would also be our first quote-unquote real intensive, as early college students since the ones back in August was just to get us to make friends, become more comfortable with our peers. So therefore, this intensive would of course aim to help us answer the question, who am I? So, this intensive took place on Wednesday, October 3rd. For this intensive, we pretty much toured the city our school is in. We saw a lot of historical sites, buildings, and other stuff. But before we headed off, we first went straight to seminar, since this was the class that was associated with intensives, and also recalled that I had seminar with my geometry teacher. Anyways, when we arrived, he split us into 5 groups of 4. Each group was provided with a large laminated poster that had 3 boxes drawn on it, with each box encompassing each other. This poster is called a mystery piece, and this is what I'll be referring to when I talk about it again later in this story time, as well as in parts 6 and 7. So how mystery pieces work was that there are 3 boxes created over 4 layers. The first layer, or the very outer layer, would be the common piece layer. The second layer, or the outer inner layer, was the gallery walk layer. The third layer, or the middle inner layer, was the expert file layer. And the fourth layer, or the center box, was the mystery piece itself. So to start, let's talk about the first layer, being the common piece layer. Our teacher put up some pictures on a smart board, and we basically had to write down our notices and wonders. We did these quite often in crew, where our book would often have notice and wonder charts for us to do different things before doing different activities for crew. So I was quite familiar with how these worked and what to put on these. Afterwards, our teacher took us to another classroom, where a multitude of pictures and other older photos were laid across. This was the gallery walk, where we of course walked around a gallery of pictures. When we got back to our classroom, we wrote down our notices and wonders for its layers. Then for the third layer, our teacher gave us some files. Each file consisted of some articles and other information talking about the history of our county, as well as the city our county was in. Or, the city... Actually, that doesn't make sense. Basically the city that our school was in. We then wrote down our notices and wonders there. Afterwards, we were asked to put in the middle box the main idea we got from the notices and wonders. This was an easy one, as literally everyone said the history of our city, so when our teacher announced that the intensive would focus on the history of our city, literally no one was surprised. So once we finished that up, we as a grade were combined into a multi-purpose room. We were then split by gender and then boarded the buses, so boys were on one bus and girls were on the other. By this point, we were all friends with each other, so this bus was much wilder and louder than the one from our previous intensive. I sat beside Dylan throughout our trip. Anyways, the first intensive we went on was the city park on the west side of town. Now, this was a very familiar place for me, as this is where the 50-meter outdoor pool was for those who haven't seen part 4, that those who've seen part 4 might recognize as where my morning practice were, as well as where my 3rd and 4th swim meets were. However, this place also had a bunch of other stuff outside the pool, given that this was the city park. It also had a track, a golf course, an inside building similar to that of Hadley Park's recreational area from Fuge, a carousel, and a miniature train. The carousel and miniature train are what I'll be putting my attention towards here. Let's start with the carousel. So unfortunately, we didn't get to ride this thing. However, we did learn about its history, how the park managed to get it, and all that stuff. By the way, we had to take notes on this stuff too, so as we were all given a booklet with each attraction, we had to take notes. Then we went to the miniature train. For it, we actually got to sit in the train. However, the train was definitely not made for a group of high schoolers, as we were all clustered together. In fact, I was in a car with Dylan, and he had to leave one leg out so that both of us could fit in. Afterwards, we boarded the buses and headed over to the downtown area of our city. Now, you'll come to know that even though my school was of course really good and amongst the best high schools in the state, the city it's in is really bad. The city is known for a lot of poverty and drugs, and this is especially seen in the west and downtown areas, so we had to be extra careful when touring the place. So, once we arrived, we were split in 3 groups, with each group being led by one freshman teacher. I was in the world history teachers group, so he toured us around and showed us a particularly large houses and explained the history of them. These houses, now city-designated historical sites, were homes to many influential people who once lived in the city, including musicians, business owners, and even the founder of that nearby college we toured for our first intensive. Afterwards, we visited a local theater in the area. This theater was founded by a folk musician from the 40s. This was a pretty important place for the city historically, as many famous musicians have performed at this theater, including a few big names like Elvis Presley and Whitney Houston. It was also a big deal back in the day for being one of the few places in the city that was desegregated before the civil rights movement. The musician who founded the theater was strongly against segregation, so he made the theater desegregated. Afterwards, we went to a museum dedicated to a famous banjo player from the 60s and 70s. This museum was actually really new, opening up just 6 years before we visited. Before that, it was the old county courthouse, and it had been that way for a very long time. In fact, such a long time that we even visited a spot where public hangings were once done. Anyways, going back to the museum, this was probably the best part of the trip. The museum had a whole lot of banjos just laying around, and we were allowed to play them for as long as we wanted to. So that's what we did. Of course, none of us knew shit about playing banjo, so although we were still at least sounded better than Taylor Swift, we were still pretty ass. Afterwards, we went and visited another theater. We didn't get to go inside it since it had gone bankrupt a while back, but we did get to see the outside of it. Unlike the theater from earlier though, this one was segregated during the civil rights movement, so that might explain why it went bankrupt. Afterwards, we went over to the pavilion and ate lunch. The teachers ordered us pizza, so we had that and had our lunch. Afterwards, it was time to head back to school. However, I guess the teachers had to do something, as me and all the other boys were on the bus by ourselves for a whole 20 minutes. It also didn't help that it was really hot that day, hitting just under 90 degrees that day. Yeah, I wish it could be that warm again. This October has been freezing cold for some reason, with highs usually being in the 60s and 70s. Now, as you can expect, we were not doing well on a hot bus, and we also didn't have water, so we were sweating our asses off. However, that's when I said probably the dumbest thing I said throughout freshman year. I said, since we don't have any water, we're gonna have to drink our own cum. At least this brightened everyone up, as everyone began laughing and one dude even pretended like he was jerking off. Eventually, the teachers finally arrived and we were able to head back to school, but we still had to wrap up our college classes. So me and my half of the grade went to computers while the other half went to PE. After that, we were finally dismissed. While this intensive was nowhere near as fun as our first one, nor was it that fun at all, I still had some good memories and I do like reflecting back on it. Now, this intensive, like most other intensives we would do in the future, would also involve us doing a project. The project for this intensive was a group project where we had to create a poster discussing one or two historical things from this intensive. So it could be things like the carousel, the train, the musicians, or anything we wanted. We were randomly assigned with groups. I was thankfully put in with a group that I wasn't necessarily friends with yet, but I would become good friends with them since they were all really good people to work with. Now, we were provided all a seminar on Wednesdays to work on our project, since that day was reserved for intensives. We were also permitted to work on it whenever we didn't have any homework, so really like every other day after finishing homework. Anyways, my group originally decided to do our poster on both the musician who founded the theater and the banjo player, but after some issues regarding presenting and stuff, we decided to only make our presentation on the banjo player. And by we, I mean one kid in our group who, without anyone asking, redid the entire project and basically finished it for us in one night. That kid would be a guy named Isaac, so shout out to Isaac. I'll talk more about him next semester. Anyways, finishing the posters weren't really the only thing we did, as we also had to present these. I'll talk about presenting these when we get to November, as we presented them in front of our parents at a semi-yearly event our school did for freshmen and sophomores that I'll get to then. Now, this was not the only project we did regarding this intensive. In English, our teacher also assigned us a project to go along with this intensive. For it, we got to write a 5-paragraph essay about what identifies us, so kind of fitting in with the question of who we were. Now, if I did this assignment today, it would be a complete piece of cake, given that I've been writing for over 6 years and the fact that I've literally written and published a book. However, at the time, I was nowhere near as good as I am at writing today, so this was a little more challenging. But to be honest, this is actually a really really well-written essay. While there was a multitude of spelling and grammatical errors, the essay overall flowed really smoothly and was a really good read, even to today's standards. My teacher also agreed with me, giving me 100 on this project. Staying on topic of intensives, let's talk about the juniors. So they just finished up an intensive where they had to create a poster about an assigned college or university in North Carolina. Part of their project involved presenting to the underclassmen, sophomores, and even to an intermediate school a quarter mile away from campus. So as you can expect, we basically got to do a college fair today, or that day. We got a college fair day, where we got to visit juniors and them presenting their stuff. It was pretty cool, although nothing really stuck out to me, but it did provide some insight for what I would be doing later in my early college journey. Well, at least what I thought I'd be doing, as COVID-19 forced us to do something a little different. Alright, so enough about intensives, let's talk about crew. So in crew this month, we did three big things. One really cool little activity and two big 5 activities. First one I'll discuss was the non-Big 5 activity, and that's visiting the old early college. So my school was a lot newer than most other schools, being founded in 2009, which made my class the 10th ever class at early college, which is really cool to think about since we'll go down in early college history as being the 10th class, as well as arguably the best class according to all the early college teachers. Talk more about that in part 8. Anyways, the building we had school in was actually not built until 2012. So before then, early college was actually done in the area within the main campus of the community college. So we went over there and got to see all the old classrooms, the old cafeteria, and got to see the layout of how the first 3 classes went to school. By the way, I love going back and seeing the history of early college. It's even cooler knowing that I too have a huge piece in early college history, being the first and so far the only student to ever graduate with a high school diploma, associates in science, and an extra certificate a semester early, which I'll go into more detail about in part 8 and why that was such a big deal then. But it's still cool to see how the school evolved. Like even today, I'm still in contact with some students, and according to them, things have changed so much. Now, for the first Big 5, that would be the Amazing Crew Race. So this was an event hosted every year. This is a competition between each crew where they, as you can expect, compete in a race. The winner gets first pick on a crew color and will represent them for the rest of the school year. The race included a multitude of activities that we all competed against. Anyways, most of these activities were for the most part forgettable, since the upperclassmen did most of them. However, once we did the second to last one, we had to go to the multipurpose room for the last one. So after Naruto running down the hall faster than the Hokage himself, we made it to the multipurpose room and saw a multitude of cups by a table. This activity differed from the others, as only freshmen were allowed to participate, meaning any other couple of freshmen got to partake in it. For it, we had to stack cups using some chopsticks. This was very difficult, as not only was it easy to slip up, but the upperclassmen got frustrated pretty easily, so we were struggling quite intensively on this. but ultimately, we pulled through and ended up winning second place. Therefore, we got second pick on the colors. We ultimately went with purple, so our crew color for the year was purple. As for the second of the big five, that would be the annual Rube Goldberg machine. So the Rube Goldberg machine is a contraption that involves performing a task in one of the most drawn out and complicated ways. For our Rube Goldberg machine, our goal was to get an army man to fall down safely via parachute. We had to have at least 10 steps regarding this thing, so we got to work. Now, I didn't contribute much to this other than provide the tape, so that's what I did. I simply brought tape and I was done. Everyone else got to work, and literally after wrapping up the amazing crew race, we recorded the video of our Rube Goldberg machine, meaning we were finally done with it. So now that stuff is discussed, let's go back and talk about academics. To start, let's talk about how mine and the American history teacher's relationship changed for the better. So knowing that I had spent a whole lot of my time goofing off in his class, he decided to ask me to show him my grades, as he was expecting that I was not doing too well. So I showed him my grades, and they were really good, with me making A's and B's, even for college. After seeing my grades and even refreshing them to prove I didn't edit them, he pretty much apologized, and then for the remainder of my time at early college, he referred to me as Brother Baynard, as a playing on from Big Brother from 1984, a book that I'll talk quite a bit about in part 8 since I read it in 12th grade. Anyways, other than that, we also had some stuff going on in English. So after finishing To Kill a Mockingbird, we finally moved on to our next novel, Speak, by Laurie Anderson. This is a book about a 9th grader who gets raped at a party and then calls the police, where the party is taken over by police and she gets a ton of hate and immediately becomes super unpopular because people didn't know that she was raped. Throughout the book, she had a habit of drawing a whole bunch of trees, which symbolized something that I don't really remember. By the way, as I went into detail about back in part 1, English has always been my least favorite subject for this reason. Like, teachers expect you to read between the lines and inverse stuff. This is especially bad for me, as I'm autistic, which makes reading in between the lines and understanding implied behavior and other stuff very difficult. Like, when I read that the curtains were blue, I read it as the curtains were fucking blue. Not that the curtains symbolized the depression, the character, or whatever bullshit English teachers seem to make up. Anyways, we did a project regarding trees. So for a project, we had to draw trees and include some things on the trees that represent us. I can't speak on this too much, as I've completely forgotten what I did for this project, but I do remember doing it very well. Now, this project was the only project we did for Speak, as we also wrote a research paper on a mental health issue of our choice. I chose to write about self-harm, given that I unfortunately have experience with it. I went into great detail about it in part 4, but pretty much every day from early February of 2018, when I became suicidal, to March 8th, the day I attempted suicide, I stabbed myself nearly every day for hours at a time with something sharp, usually a pencil. It was an incredibly brutal time for me, especially given that the only satisfaction and happiness I received during that time was from slitting the skin of my hand, palm, and sometimes near my heart. I thankfully would come to the realization that what I was doing was awful when I tried to officially take my own life, but unfortunately, this stuff even sticks with me today. While I don't harm myself or think about it anymore, I still have trauma about it, often dreaming about it and often getting flashbacks from it whenever I see wounds even over 5 years later. Anyways, I thankfully didn't have to describe my story with it in this paper, especially given by the fact that I was very hesitant to talk about the situation at the time. In fact, it wouldn't be until I wrote and recorded Storytime 10 back in March of 2021 when I officially came forward publicly about my suicide attempt. But all I had to do for this paper was write a research paper about self-harm in APA format. So I did that, and the paper was a success. Other than being a heavy topic to discuss given my experience, this wasn't too bad of a paper to write, and I was credited with 100 for it. One last thing to discuss for English, we also had a special little assignment for Halloween. So this was, in my opinion, one of the cooler assignments we did for this class. For it, we were provided with a prompt with some sort of Halloween theme, and we also had to write a short story based on the prompt. Unfortunately, I've since completely forgotten my spooky story, but I remember it being a really fun assignment to do, and I wish I could do more assignments like this. Alright, so with that said, that pretty much wraps up October. October 2018 was a pretty decent month, so let's move on to November 2018. This would not be the best month, given that it would of course be when post-depression period part 1 ended. It would also be the month where me and my English teacher's hatred for one another was at its highest point, so let's talk about that first. So even though I had already talked about the projects we did for Speak, we actually did not finish the book until November. However, this book was a really easy read, and I even got ahead of it in it, allowing me to finish before the end of October. So therefore, whenever we were asked to read a chapter or two in class, I usually just did random stuff on my computer like what I did for Second Blood. This, however, did not do well with my teacher, who expected us to be reading the whole time, So one day, while I was goofing off, she called me and got really mad, asking me why I wasn't reading and stuff. I told her that I had already finished, but she wouldn't oblige, and as a punishment, I was forced to sit at a desk beside hers. This would go on for the next 2 weeks, although I would be allowed to sit back at my own desk afterwards when she realized I did in fact actually read the whole book. This was one of the few times where, looking back on our arguments, I was actually in the right, as I had read the whole book, so she shouldn't have gotten mad at me for my case. She did at least apologize to me in front of the class, and while our relationship still stayed sour, things would get better until eventually the relationship became really good, which I'll get to in March. Now, my relationship with my English teacher was one reason as to why Post-Depression Period Part 1 ended, since of course dealing with her every day was not the best. However, it also ended because of swimming. So of course dealing with my coach was awful, especially since he was starting to notice that me and Zoe were losing our motivation to swim. So he decided that instead of trying to motivate us and get us interested in swimming like a good coach, he was going to make swimming as rough and obnoxious as possible. So that's what happened. Practices became obnoxious, and I was beginning to absolutely dread practices. However, November was a big month for swimming, not just for practices were becoming obnoxious, but I will also swim my first official swim meet since I broke my arms this month. So on Saturday, November 17th, I got to swim my 11th swim meet. This is going to be the last swim meet I swim until June of 2021. While I do have another meet to discuss later in the story time, I'll mention why I didn't swim it when we get there. Anyways, this meet was a large 3-day meet that took place in Rock Hill, South Carolina, city about 30 minutes south of uptown Charlotte. This would be my first and only meet not in North Carolina, but considering Rock Hill was only like 30 minutes from where I live, since I live pretty close to the South Carolina state line, it wasn't like we were traveling too far, just across the state line. Now, if you saw part 4, you might recall at my previous meet, our coach pulled a dick move and only signed me up for Sunday, since he knew that we had church and he was a raging atheist. Additionally, that was the day that the 100 butterfly was done, so he wanted me to swim that day, so I of course could swim my least favorite event. And just to put the icing on the cake, the 50 freestyle, my favorite event because I'm a sprinter, was done on Sunday, but after I asked to be put in the event, my coach put everyone except me in it. Yeah, this guy really wanted to fuck with me. And unfortunately, he would fuck with me again on this meet. So this time, Mom made sure to only sign me up for Sunday, November 17th, since of course we had church on Sunday. However, our coach wanted to get Mom's sign-up request and sign me up for both Saturday and Sunday. On Saturday, I was signed up to swim the 200 backstroke, 50 freestyle, 100 breaststroke, and 100 freestyle. On Sunday, I was signed up to swim the 200 freestyle, 200 breaststroke, 100 butterfly, and the 200 IM. Yeah, despite it being 8 months since my last official meet, my coach was having me do way more than what I should have been doing. But considering this coach didn't care about my arms being broken and only cared about when I would get back to swimming, it's honestly expected. But the worst part was that he signed me up for Sunday as well. When signing me and Zoe up, Mom specifically signed me up for Saturday only. However, our coach put us in for Saturday and Sunday as a way to try and get us out of going to church. Therefore, Mom told us that we were not going to attend the meet on Sunday, only on Saturday. Although that meant that I wasn't getting out of church, although at the time I was still into church, I at least got out of swimming the 100 butterfly, so I was cool with that. So let's talk about my events, shall we? So the first event, as well as the toughest, was the 200 backstroke. Why the fuck my coach thought having me do 200 of my worst stroke on my first meet back from an injury involving my arms was a good idea, I have no clue. And needless to say, this was a tough event because, well, backstroke is my least favorite stroke, so this took a while. And by a while, I mean I got a time of 3 minutes and 26 seconds. Yeah, this was not a fun event. But I got through it, and the guy in the lane left of me shook my hands and congratulated me, even if he beat me by 30 seconds. But that was cool at least. Afterwards, I got to do my favorite event for the first time in over a year, the 50 freestyle. I was really looking forward to this event, as I had begged my coach to let me swim in it for the longest time. And now that I was in it, I could finally swim it. So I gave it my all, and ended up getting a time of 29.29 seconds. The fastest 50 freestyle I had ever swum up to that point, and a 3-second improvement from my previous 50 freestyle the year prior. It also was just an amazing swim, given that this was my first meet in 8 months after breaking both my arms back in March. So it's cool to see that I was still a beast in the water. Additionally, this time would stay for a very long time, as it wouldn't be until I was 18 years old when I finally got a faster time, being a time of 28.53 seconds. If I ever do a series like this for college, it would be in part 2 of that series, as that meet was during the summer of 2022, which was the summer prior to my second semester of college. Now, getting back to this event, my next event would be the 100 breaststroke. For it, I got a time of 1 minute and 35 seconds. While significantly slower to my best of 1 minute 26 seconds, it was still not a bad time given that 1 minute and 26 second time was done in a pool I was very familiar with. It was a home meet from January that year. Then for my last event of that day, it was the 100 freestyle. For it, I got 1 minute and 15 seconds, which was a new best by 3 seconds. This too would stand for a long time, like the 50 freestyle, only that it stood for almost 5 years. It was not until just a few weeks ago when I timed myself and managed to get a time of 1 minute 14 seconds and 0.43 seconds. So it stayed up there for a while. And with that, I was now done with the meet. Unknown to me at the time, this would be my last meet I swam for over 2.5 years. Of course, later in the story time, I'll talk about quitting the team, but then in part 8, I'll talk about getting back into swimming, as well as of course my first meet after such a long time. Now, because me and Zoe missed the meet Sunday, Mom decided to have us not go to practice the next week, since she knew our coach was going to be pissed off at us for missing events. It also helped that there was only practices on Mondays and Tuesday, since that was Thanksgiving week, so that made it easier for us to not go to practice. Ultimately, I consider this the end of this meet to be when post-depression period part 1 ended. This meet, while I considered it as a success, would ultimately further demotivate me from swimming, given how my coach somehow managed to be just as much of an asshole at this meet as he was at my last meet. This would also be the meet that made me not want to swim at the swim meets anymore, knowing that my coach was going to put me in my least favorite events. While he did put me in the same events I wanted to swim at this meet, he also put me in events I didn't want to do, nor was ready to do, aka the 200 backstroke, especially after just getting back into meets after an injury. And he was even worse during smaller meets, since he would place me in a more bad events. As a result, this would go on to be the last meet I swim, until June of 2021, but not the last one I was signed up for. I'll talk about that in January. But there was also non-swimming factors too that made me fall from this great time period. Most notably my relationship with my English teacher, as that was affecting me quite a bit. You also had the stress from other things that made me exit the post-depression period and enter a time period I refer to as the intermission period. This time period, which lasted from November 18th, 2018 to March 22nd, 2019, was not a good time for me, with the main things affecting me being swimming and my English teacher. When we get to March, I'll talk about how the intermission period ended and what caused post-depression period part 2 to begin. So, going back to academics, let's talk about geometry. Now, I haven't mentioned this class all that much throughout the story time, as honestly, even though it was fun and our teacher was cool, there isn't a whole lot to comment on, but at least here I can begin talking about it since we did a project. At the time, we were discussing trigonometry, so for a project, our teacher had us create a triangle out of anything we wanted to, just that we had to design it and also have it balance on a nail. The way we got triangles to balance on nails is by placing the triangle on the nails in the center. To do that, we had to use some trigonometric formula that I've since forgotten. Anyways, I didn't do anything too special for my triangle. I just used some paper, colored the Triforce from The Legend of Zelda on it, and made sure it could balance. Then one day during class, our teacher had us all present our triangles and balance them, so I did mine and it worked. I think I only made an 89 on the project since some of my calculations were wrong, but for the most part, this is an easy project. Another class I haven't touched on much in the story time that I want to focus on now is community health. So during this month, we were assigned a research paper. For it, we could write a research paper about any public health issue of our choice except obesity, since our professor did this project herself and used her paper as an example. We just had just finished our unit on underage drinking and the issues surrounding it, so I figured I'd write my paper on that same thing since it was on my mind and it was fresh. So that's what I did during second block for 3 days. Hey, look, I was actually doing something in second block. What are the odds? Anyways, writing the paper itself wasn't all that memorable. I just did my research, cited my sources, and all that stuff. But what is memorable is getting a review. So being my first ever research paper for college, I figured that I would get Mom to help me proofread the paper. So that's what I did. I got Mom to read it over. However, she was not impressed at all. She argued that this was a terribly written paper and that the highest grade I could expect to receive on this paper would be a C. We ended up going back and forth for a while until eventually she gave up and said that I was going to fail this paper. I ended up not taking any advice she gave me just because I was so frustrated. But additionally, I was scared that I was going to make a low grade on this paper that I otherwise thought was fine. However, soon came the day my paper was graded, and the grade I received on it was nothing like what Mom or even I expected. The paper was worth 600 points. I got 599 points on it. As a percentage, that translates to a 99.83. Yeah, that's a stupidly high grade. The only reason I missed a point was because I incorrectly did an in-text citation. But other than that, my professor said that my paper was perfect. So that night, I went and told Mom what my grade was on the paper, and she was completely astonished, as she did not expect me to make that high of a grade. In fact, she didn't even believe me until I showed her my grade on my Chromebook. Since then, I've promised to not let mom review any papers I write, and I think that's worked pretty well since I've done well on almost everything on a writing assignment since then. The rest of the community help would flow very nicely, and I'll explain what my final grade for the course was when we get to December. So, moving on from that, let's talk about a thing my school does for freshmen and sophomores called student-led conferences, or SLCs as I'll refer to them as. These were things we did each semester where we basically got to show our parents a portfolio of our coursework and got to show them what we were doing in our classes, in intensives, in crew, and in our college classes. For these, we were provided with a large binder and a table of content sheet with it. The table of content sheet included each high school class and what assignments our teacher wanted us to include. This was treated more like a checklist, where we would get that respective assignment that included on our SLC binder, in the order it should be in. And then our seminar teacher, aka my geometry teacher, would look over the binder and make sure everything was on it. Once he confirmed everything, he would sign at the bottom of the table of the contents to confirm that I did everything correctly. This signature, alongside our intensive projects, were what our seminar grades relied on. Since this was a pass or fail class, if we had the signature and did our intensive projects, we passed seminar. If not, we failed. So getting our SLC binder in the correct format and doing these intensives were crucial for our grade. Now, this first SLC was a little rough getting getting ready for, as my teacher immediately rejected signing my binder when he saw that I had nothing for world history. I tried to explain to him that I took world history back in 8th grade, but he did not believe me for some reason. But thankfully, after other students who had also taken world history in 8th grade didn't have anything for world history, he realized that I was being truthful and apologized to me and everyone else not in world history. The same thing would actually happen in 10th grade with regards to Earth Environmental Science, since I also took that class back in 8th grade. I'll talk about that in part 6. But anyways, after that mistake was resolved, I was able to get my binder signed, and as a result, I was passing the seminar this semester. Additionally, this SLC was a lot different than the other two I did back in high school because we would also be presenting our intensive project. So remember earlier when I talked about me and my group making the poster on the banjo player for that intensive? Specifically when I said that we would present these, well, SLCs would be when we present these. At the beginning of the conference, we as a group would present them to our parents, and then afterwards, we would unite with our parents to go over our SLC binder. Now, what made this even more unique than the other SLCs was that since we were presenting our intensive project, we had to collectively as a group agree on a time for SLCs. SLCs were done in 30-minute time frames, ranging from as early as 4 o'clock to as late as 6:30. We could not leave school until SLCs were done, so the later SLC time simply meant waiting longer. Thankfully, Mom wanted us to do these at 4. And my group also wanted to do them at 4, so we signed up for 4. Anyways, let's move on to the actual day of SLCs, being Thursday, November 15th. So after PE, I walked with Isaac to the multipurpose room since we both had PE. Pretty soon, Mom as well as Isaac's grandmother arrived, so we 4 collectively talked until it was 4 o'clock. Once it hit 4, a group was called, so we all collectively went to the world history teacher's classroom, where he would look over the SLC and kind of monitor them. So first we presented our intensive project. We rehearsed earlier that day, so all of us were quite familiar with what we were presenting. Isaac presented the majority of it since he created the whole thing, while me and the others took on a section each. Overall, it was a success, and our parents were all quite impressed. Afterwards, we went with our parents and individually went through our SLC binders. So I simply showed Mom throughout my binder and showed her all the stuff I was doing. By the way, Dad had to work that night, so he didn't come. He wouldn't attend any SLCs since Thursdays were usually his work late days at the company he worked for at the time, and those always took place on Thursdays. But going back to SLCs, Mom was quite impressed with it. Even though she did come across a 40 I made on a To Kill a Mockingbird pop quiz, she had already seen it, so she didn't say anything about it. But other than that, the rest of the SLC binder looked great. Once we finished, I took her to the hallway to look at my speak tree, and then afterwards, we signed out and went home. So with that, my first of 3 SLCs finished. I would do another SLC in April freshman year, which I'll discuss near the end of the story time, and then I would do my third one in November 2019 as a 10th grader, which I'll of course discuss in part 6. We normally would do a 4th one during the springs of sophomore year, but I'll explain the unique circumstances that caused them not to happen in part 6. So that pretty much wraps up everything that happened in November. Let's move on to December. December 2018 was a pretty good month overall. Definitely one of the better months of the intermission period. So to start, let's talk about finals. Now, unlike the previous story times in the series where the fall semester ended right before Martin Luther King Jr. Day, my school's fall semester ended on the last day of Christmas break, since that's when our college's fall semester ended. Therefore, the moment we got to 2019, we'll be on to the second semester. So to start, let's talk about finals. So I only had 2 finals during this time, one for geometry and one for computers. Let's talk about the one for computers first. So this was the only final I had for a college course, as my other ones didn't have a final. How it worked was that one day during class, we simply took the final online. It was a massive 100 question test that had to be taken within a 75-minute window. So this was not going to be an easy task. Now, I was quite scared about this exam. Throughout the semester, I had done really well with bringing my grades up to the point that I was now sitting at an 83. My goal was to keep a B in the class, so I would need to make a high enough grade on the final in order to make that happen. However, I was given much needed adequate time studying to prepare for this exam. The reason is because I was provided with enough time. And the reason that is because that week it snowed. Now, as I've explained in previous story times, snow is not very common here in the South. In fact, the last time we've had snow was in January 2022, so it doesn't snow here very often. Now, how this ties into school is that if it snows even a quarter of an inch, school is immediately canceled since our roads are not built to handle snow. And of course, that's what happened this week. I believe it snowed on Monday, so we got every day except Thursday and Friday off due to snow. At least by then, the snow had melted and we could return to school. But during this time, I made sure to study for the computers exam, so I at least had time for it. Alright, so on Friday, December 14th, during class, I took the final. It was a tough exam, but I ultimately got through and made a 63 on it. My grade only dropped by a point, putting me at an 82 for the final grade. I was very relieved to see this, since I of course was meeting my goal of making a B in the class. Then that day, Dad would also pick me up from school since he had the day off. So when I told him about my grade, we decided to celebrate by getting some Chick-fil-A. Definitely a nice way to celebrate finishing off one of the hardest community college classes I took back in high school, and I literally took it my first semester there. So with that said, let's talk about my other final I took, that being for geometry. So throughout this series, especially in part 4, I talked about the different standardized tests and the state of North Carolina administers, from the EOGs to the NCFEs to the EOCs. EOGs are only administered from 3rd to 8th grade, so I won't be discussing them anymore in the series. I'll talk more about the EOCs when we get to May, as the geometry final was an NCFE, or North Carolina final exam. Pretty much what this meant was that the exam was pretty similar to just a normal multiple choice exam that you would see in college course, where there are 40 multiple choice questions and your grade is based on how many of them you can get right. We were provided with 2 hours to take the exam, which is more than enough time to get through it, so these weren't too bad. They did count for 20% of our grade, so we did have to do well on this in order to maintain a good grade in the class. Anyways, we took this exam on Monday, December 17th. Now, how standardized tests work for high school was that we took our exams in the multi-purpose room. So once it hit 8:30, we went to the lockers to put our stuff up, and then those of us in geometry went back in the multi-purpose room to take the final. Additionally, we would also be joined by the 10th graders who took Algebra 1 back in 9th grade. Normally at my school, you took Geometry and Algebra 2 in the 10th grade, but if you took Algebra 1 in 8th grade, you got to take Geometry and Algebra 2 in 9th grade, which of course is what I did. Anyways, nothing memorable happened during the exam, but there was a pretty funny thing that happened before the test started. So in the class, we always wanted to keep our calculators into degrees mode. By the way, this whole test was calculator active, so we could use the calculator for any problem. However, when solving trigonometric functions, we needed to have our calculators in degrees mode. So at the beginning of the semester, our teacher assigned one student to be the guy who always asked if we needed to set our calculators to degrees mode. Our teacher would then respond with, "I cannot tell you whether or not you need to set your calculator to degrees," since he technically was not allowed to say so. But by a student simply asking this question, we would all remember to put our calculator in degrees, and our teacher wouldn't be breaking the rules since he didn't say anything we had to or not. So with that, it was time to begin the exam. Once again, not a very memorable exam, so once I finished, I was officially done with geometry. I don't even remember what grade I made on this test, but I do remember finishing geometry off with a 90, so I at least made an A in this class. As for the other classes, the only ones I had left to discuss are English and Crew, so let's talk about those. In English, we got to watch the movie for Speak, and holy shit, it was bad. This acting was genuinely the worst acting I'd ever seen. Like, not even Darman videos have acting this horrible. Like, despite being a very serious movie, none of us could take it seriously, which, while somewhat funny, it's actually really sad since of course this movie does have a very serious and meaningful message regarding sexual assault and mental health. In fact, I'd argue that this movie portrayed these topics horribly just because the acting was that bad. So yeah, fuck this movie. The book's good, but the movie was terrible. Alright, so let's talk about Crew. So during this month, we talked about orienteering, Orienteering is pretty much running around outside towards a specific set of coordinates. I can't really give a better explanation than this other than comparing this to Tanjiro hunting demons in Demon Slayer while Zenitsu is going crazy for Nezuko, but that's pretty much what we were doing. So how this worked was that each crew went around the entire campus of our school and placed clues in hidden spots. We would then record the coordinates, and that would be the coordinates that other crews would use in order to try to get to our clues. On Tuesday, December 18th, we did a competition where each crew tried to gather as many clues as they could. Anyways, this took a few weeks of preparation. Me and two juniors were in charge of placing the clues, so during crew, we would go outside and run around the campus and place clues while often doing parkour stunts since there were a lot of those places for us to do those outside. As for the competition, I don't really remember much from it. I know my crew did not win, but we did a great job, so that's all I can really say about it. And with that brings me to the last day of the fall 2018 semester, Wednesday, December 19th. Finally, my first semester of high school was coming to an end. So as a way to celebrate the holidays, our school held a Christmas party, where multiple spots were opened up for us. Some spots included watching the Polar Express, aka the show with that one nerdy kid with glasses who scaringly looks like me, play games, do karaoke, or do whatever. As for what I did, I fell asleep. Yep, I just simply went to sleep. I stayed up quite late that night before, so I was tired, so I caught up on Z's. In fact, Dylan even had to wake me up when it was over, so while I kind of missed out on some stuff, I at least got caught up on sleep. So with that, let's talk about Christmas break. So Christmas 2018 was pretty good. I got a new phone, that being the iPhone 6, so I finally had a new phone again. I also had this phone until Christmas 2020, when I got a new phone, being the iPhone XR, which I've had since then. I also got some new Pokemon games, so I spent a good time playing those and spending time on my phone. The next day, we took off for Gatlinburg, Tennessee. This is a resort city located in the Great Smoky Mountains, so about 4 hours away since driving in the mountains takes a little longer. We didn't do a whole lot up there. My uncle and his kids from Delaware came down, so we hung out with them, but other than that, we didn't do a whole lot. However, this would also be around the time that I officially revealed to my parents that I was uninterested in continuing swimming. Even though they knew I didn't want to do meets, they didn't know I hated swimming. At the time, it was pretty small and they didn't think much of it, but over the next 3 months, this would become the source of many very heated discussions between me, Zoe, and Mom versus Dad. Me and Zoe hated swimming and especially hated our coach, while our mom hated our coach too and wanted us to quit. Meanwhile, Dad wanted us to stay swimming. I'll talk about which one of us won when we get to March. So that pretty much wraps up part A of part 5 of the extensive reflection project. In part B, I'll discuss the spring 2019